World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin here with a huge episode of World War III updates here on April 4th, 2026, as we enter, I believe it's the 5th or almost the 6th week of the Purim War, the Iran War, the Jewish-American War of Aggression against the land of the Aryans, World War III, whatever it is you want to call it. Of course, we have been covering this conflict and the diplomacy and other conflicts preceding it now since 2022. So welcome to the World War Now show. I know we have a lot of new audience members, so I probably need to make a channel trailer or something explaining all of these sorts of things. But huge amounts of updates this week. Of course, major losses from the United States in the Persian Gulf, in Iran, F-15s, A-10s, AWACS. I mean, the whole kit and caboodle, millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars at this point, down the drain at this point. Currently, again, I almost wish this had broken before we went live and recording, but of course now U.S. forces are patrolling Iran, a certain region. We're going to discuss all of the details, of course, searching for a downed F-15 pilot. One of the pilots of a shot down F-15 was recovered. The other one is now in Iran. I'd wager is likely to be captured by Iranian forces, but as we are recording this, apparently fierce fights are occurring on the ground in Iran. So that is right. The title is not lying to you. Boots are on the ground in Iran. Supposedly at least several dozen, I would wager, forces in Iran have landed there to try to rescue this F-15 pilot. So pray for everybody involved. Of course, I've been praying for our armed forces. I've been praying for the people of Iran who are facing this aggression. I've even been praying for the Iranian armed forces, that everybody would be as just as possible and that this whole thing would be something that doesn't turn into marauding brigandry. But of course, we are working at the behest of the Jews, unfortunately, so I can't say that we are winning any points here for any kind of just wars. But regardless, there's a whole lot more to discuss. Major negotiations were declined by the Iranians. Russia and China are looking at all of this with fascination. And of course, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon is not faring very well. They never do well on the ground. They didn't do well on the ground in Gaza. They're going to do even worse in Lebanon. And that is what is happening right now. So before we shout out the Ether Hour content this week, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. It has been a very eventful week. Lots of people complaining, lots of people sad that the Americans well and truly are now potentially suffering the first wave of severe losses in combat, actually. And finally, the story is striking home that, yes, the United States is again at war in the Middle East under the administration of Donald J. Trump, who literally ran on the message of not sending American troops abroad, not sending American hardware abroad, and not putting anyone at risk, and yet also blaming previous administrations, the deep state, the swamp, the Democrats, whomever, but never the Israelis. And it does seem like there's even been some preliminary reports, Conrad, and I think our listeners would find this quite amusing, that if there will be boots on the ground, and as you will listen to this episode, there really are boots on the ground right now. The Israelis won't be actually sending anyone down, to Iranian soil, to Persia itself, to actually attempt to secure the ostensible win, whatever that may be at this point. So it definitely has been a huge week, I think, for everybody, domestically speaking, for the American psyche, which really Donald J. Trump hasn't prepared people for, and all the hurrah antics of Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of War, haven't really assisted the situation at all. But it does seem like the war well and truly rages on, and we are very far from any sort of ceasefire.
No, that is very, very true. All of this 2 to 3 weeks, one more week, they always go back and forth between those things. All of this is now in Iran's hands, and Iran clearly wants to punish the United States. They've rejected negotiations. They rejected a 48-hour ceasefire. They walked away from the Pakistani debate negotiation table, I guess. I guess it would have also been a debate table based on how things were going, but they walked away from that. Qatar is reneging on its obligation to try to facilitate negotiations. So this is a long war. So strap in, folks. It's all going down as the Saints predicted, as we predicted here on World War Now. But speaking of all of that, there's never been a better time to become a World War Now supporter. I don't think we've had a week full of this much content for everybody in a very long time, but we have been cranking, really, really sweating away in the content kitchen. So be sure to get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co to listen to our recent Ether Hour episodes. We have a fantastic episode with Warren Baylog, host of the War Strike podcast. And for free, that's right, free Ether Hour episode. When was the last time you heard that? It's been a long time. We interviewed the former defense minister of Lebanon, Yaqub Riyad Sarraf. He was not only the former defense minister of Lebanon for 3 years, he was the minister of the environment. He was the governor of Beirut. He was the governor of Mount Lebanon. Very, very well versed, high-ranking diplomat, politician in Lebanon, devout Orthodox Christian. We discuss everything going on with him, the war, Lebanon, the invasion there, the war with Iran, the war in the Gulf, the potential of troops on the ground from the United States, what that would look like, the history of Lebanon, the Antiochian Patriarchate there, and his time there, his time on Mount Athos. He visited there extensively. So check all of this out. These will all be linked below. And of course, another big thing we have to remind everybody of is the Q&A thread. We are going to be recording the Q&A on Monday, April 6th. So the Q&A thread will be linked down below. If you're not already a paid subscriber, please get behind the paywall. You'll get access to all of the Ether Hour content and the Q&A thread to ask us any question you want, which will be answered at length in an upcoming Ether Hour subscriber-only episode, like I said, being recorded in just a few days. So get your questions in soon because the thread is about to be locked. But with all of that, it's time to move on from the news. Also, like this episode. I always forget, like the episode, whether you're listening on YouTube, Substack, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, X, wherever it is where you're listening. Like the episode, leave a comment, share. It really helps us out. We try to respond to comments. So thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. It's been a crazy few weeks here with everything going on. And the prophecies, I think, have only been fulfilled and will continue to be fulfilled. We're going to be discussing that and so much more this evening. But I think what everyone wants to know about are these planes, these military losses, first of all, as the war rages on. So, Dimitri, if you maybe want to break down the initial losses, what we know right now. Of course, we've heard of these Black Hawks shot down. We know about the A-10 Warthog shot down where it crashed apparently into the Persian Gulf. The pilot was supposedly rescued. We had the F-15 shot down. One of the pilots was rescued. Another one of the pilots ejected and is basically being fought over right now. Supposedly, the A-10 Warthog that was shot down was involved with the search and rescue mission for this F-15 pilot. So this is an operation that has now led to several losses, potentially even more casualties. And we're also getting reports that Hegseth and the Department of War are lying about casualty numbers overall. So major sort of military collapse here. It looks like Iran has been bearing it and bearing its teeth and bearing the brunt of these punches, but it's starting to, like I said, inflict high casualties and high value losses, monetary losses on the United States. So if you want to break down these recent losses, it's not just the things in these operations, but multiple major strikes on Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other bases have led to major U.S. hardware losses. Dimitri, if you want to break those down for the audience.
No, absolutely. I think it's been a week of sobering up for the American war machine, in particular the deep state and all of those people who were believing that this would simply be a special combat operation, as Donald J. Trump called it, a peaceful intervention, a way to bring Iran to its knees by firstly assassinating all of those innocent people as well as leaders. And it does seem like that has been sort of swept away, that particular illusion, because well and truly Iran is fighting back, whether it's using its SAMs, the surface-to-air missiles, whether it's using its drone technologies, ballistic missiles for long-range launches on American hangars, airstrips, bases all around the Middle East in a crescent moon type formation, all the way from Iraq going all around to every single Gulf state country has been impacted at this point, which has had an American base on its soil. In fact, we even discussed weeks prior that Iran has in fact targeted even the British bases located on Cyprus. So Iran does have its eye out on actually liberating the Middle East from any sort of American military presence. In a way, they are doing, in the long term, I believe, probably a favor to all of the Arab countries and other Middle Eastern states, to sort of dislodge the American war machine from its position that they've taken since, the beginning of the Cold War, really, and since the victory of America in the Second World War. But well and truly, I think none of these nations are appreciating what Iran has really engaged in. And by the way, Iran obviously is doing this after a severe provocation, the killing of many of its leaders. I mean, the level of the level of arrogance really displayed by Pete Hegseth specifically and President Donald J. Trump during his speech on the 1st of April. So this past Wednesday, Donald J. Trump gave the 20-minute speech where he said that, look, we've struck at Iran's nuclear facility located deep within Iran. Most likely was referring to Pickaxe Mountain. He says that it's going to take them months and months to actually uncover all of the damage and perhaps retrieve any of the material being stored down there. So Trump made open threats on live television to an international as well as a domestic American audience and said that the United States is only going to have any sort of peaceful or ceasefire deal if the Iranians are actually brought low, essentially. And in response to this, Iran, of course, does basically what the Americans were least expecting. And this is because for the last 3 to 4 weeks, the Americans every single night have been running massive sorties with, from what we heard, B-1, B-2 bombers. These are stealth bombers who fly strictly at night, protected by F-15Es, F-35 Lockheed Martin planes, which have stealth technologies in and of themselves. The F-15Es do not have that. Even there's been reports of B-52 World War II, almost like post-World War II era bombers, these massive planes flying at nighttime, dropping tons of bombs on the Iranian mountains and different ballistic missile storage facilities deep within the Iranian countryside, striking at bases, deep on the ground, or perhaps the entry points into those bases to make sure the Iranian ballistic missile volleys they've been sending at the Gulf states would be brought to an end. However, unsuccessfully so, Iran continues to, again, fire at all of the Gulf state Arab countries, including Israel, and of course the American bases stationed in the Arab countries. And to no avail, the American bombing campaigns, the only way to really disarm Iran, because Iran is not coming to the negotiating table strictly because the Americans, they haven't actually put up any, I think, ostensibly practical solutions to bringing Iran to a peace deal. Like, the Americans are not cooperating properly. The Americans are taking this position that the Iranians need to actually surrender and prevent Iran from developing any sort of nuclear energy technology for civilian needs. And we'll discuss what happens to the Bushehr power plant shortly. But in particular, one of the greatest losses in this particular week was the shooting down of an F-15E Strike Eagle plane over the western portions of Iran. And the interesting thing is the F-15E Strike Eagle, it's not confirmed yet by CENTCOM or the Americans what exactly shot down this particular American plane, but the planes do have two crew members operating. In the front seat, you have the pilot, and in the back seat, as Conrad mentioned, you do have a weapons operator. Unlike the A-10 Warthog, which was later shot down as well, literally in the same 24-hour window, when the A-10 Warthog was actually assisting the combat search and rescue helicopters, which were searching for the weapons operator who ejected out of his seat alongside with the pilot from the F-15. An A-10 Warthog plane, which only has one pilot, was also shot down by Iran. So you have combat search and rescue planes being shot down, fired by Iranians because they are flying very low. They're not flying at nighttime. They're flying during the day, trying to rescue this one weapons operator who ejected and now is in an unknown terrain somewhere, maybe in the Iranian mountains or plateau in western Iran, looking potentially for either friendly villagers or people who are opposed to Iran and trying to at least get somewhere to safety. It's completely unknown whether or not he has food, water, whether or not the weapons operator is injured. So there's almost no information. And the Iranians have already put out messages into the media calling for this weapons operator who's ejected out of the F-15E Strike Eagle to be surrendered to the authorities and to not be harmed. So potentially, as we can understand, just like in previous hostage situations when the Russo-Ukrainian war, potentially the captured weapons operator will be used as a hostage, potentially for political means, or knowing the Iranians, most likely the weapons operator will be used, Conrad, as a political hostage if there ever is a ceasefire and if there ever needs to be an exchange, just like we saw with many sort of ransom type operations between the Russians and Ukrainians. This is quite common in modern warfare. So now we just do not know the status of this particular weapons operator.
We do now, because as of this very moment, Al Jazeera has been informed by a U.S. official that the second American pilot has been recovered after a heavy firefight. So I highly doubt they would report this to the media if it wasn't true. So they seem to have recovered this person. Again, the idea that it would be super easy for the Iranians to recover him is not necessarily true. This is a huge area, a rural area where he was crashed, and the Americans, of course, can find his exact location with the GPS and the tracking devices that he has on him. But of course, I guess the news story now that we're going to be looking to see, and I'm sure the U.S. will not be particularly honest about this. I'm sure the Iranians will have their own story. The question is, how many casualties were taken in this operation to recover this person? The initial report says heavy firefights, so I can't imagine there were no casualties. Of course, this was in the region of Khogiluyan Boyer Ahmad, which is a very small province in southwestern Iran, not on the coast, but somewhat close to the coast. Obviously, that's where most of these planes are flying. So as of now, it appears the pilot has been recovered. That is good. Obviously, any kind of situation where someone is in distress like that, you wish them the best. But the question is now, how many people were lost? And would it have been better to allow him to be taken hostage, used as a way to perhaps tone down this war, tone down U.S. operations, and then be peacefully traded in, as opposed to now? How many people were lost in the operation to save him? I guess we will find out. But again, very, very interesting times. We are getting into levels of aircraft losses where, again, the AWACS and even though this fighter was recovered, of course, the jet is now down and destroyed. Like we said, the A-10 Warthog went down in the Persian Gulf. Thankfully, that pilot was recovered. Of course, at this point, we have 8 KC Stratotankers that have been damaged, 2 completely destroyed as well. We have major amounts of MQ-9 Reaper drones. We, of course, have the AWACS E3 Sentry, which costs about $300 million. At least that's what it cost to build in 1998, estimated to cost up to $750 million. Now, there's only 16 of these in rotation, and supposedly a second one was also severely damaged. So down to 14 of those in operation. Of course, an A-10 Thunderbolt was taken out. That's about $20 million worth. And rumors about helicopters, we don't know all the details, and I wouldn't be surprised if maybe another helicopter was lost in this operation to recover this F-15 pilot, but 3 have been severely damaged. We also saw today a Chinook helicopter was completely destroyed on the tarmac, I believe, somewhere in Saudi Arabia. Of course, as we're recording this as well, major strikes are happening on Kuwait and Bahrain, but we're going to talk about the petrochemical and industry strikes in a second. But all of these aircraft, along with the F-35, that was, of course, severely damaged by Iranian strikes or air defenses, is really adding up. This is hundreds of millions of dollars, if not closer to $1 billion worth of aircraft that have been lost in a month or so of warfare. And again, if Iran is really, been holding out on its air defenses, which seems to be true, they actually kept back some of their more advanced air defense systems and other ones in the midst of the initial attack so that they wouldn't get completely wiped out, so then they could have a fighting chance against certain strikes like these once the perhaps initial shock and wore off. Because again, they knew they didn't have as comprehensive of a system as Russia, America, even Israel in some capacity, at least per square mile. So they, in theory, again, took some strategic losses, didn't protect certain areas, and are now, as we are seeing, able to shoot down planes and able to have fairly organized air defense responses to all sorts of specific bombing raids. And of course, the attempt to locate a soldier in a specific region, because if you know where those people are going to be looking for the soldier, then you can get the air defense there quickly and start to shoot them down. This is what Ukraine does in Russia. They don't just leave the air defense out so that the Russians can destroy them. They move them around to try to get these strategic victories. And the Russians have lost plenty of aircraft over the skies of Ukraine based on this strategy. So, of course, now that we're months into this, we still have months more of fighting because the Iranians have rejected negotiations, which we're going to talk about in a second. But beyond all of that, the Iranians have made it clear that there's all sorts of capabilities that, of course, everyone just presumed were destroyed because of the American propaganda and because of, these sort of assumptions on how Middle Eastern wars with America as a superpower work. Everyone just believed all of it, when in reality, no, there was no air superiority over Iran on the second or third day of the war. There still isn't air superiority over Iran 36 days into the war. So that was all nonsense. The Iranian Air Force still exists. They're able to scramble jets and fly over the skies of Tehran and even defend themselves with them. Not only all of that, even the Iranian Navy, which had the most evidence behind it, that being completely destroyed, all sorts of small boats, unmanned nautical vehicles, and even certain larger naval boats are still very much operating in the Persian Gulf, and they are maintaining the closure of the Straits of Hormuz very diligently. And again, we're going to get into all of these details, but it isn't just American drones that have been shot down, a huge amount of Israeli drones, and we've even seen footage of Israeli jets, F-16s, coming under very close Iranian air defense fire and barely able to escape and come out of there. So that is the American plane losses. The other big thing, of course, the major updates in the past few hours even are these strikes. Iran, I don't know if they've taken credit explicitly, at least for the Bahrain ones. The Kuwait ones seem to be pretty decisive and targeted much more than just drones. So, of course, the idea that America would be behind that, like they have with their Lucas drone attacks on Turkey and Oman and other places that, again, Iran has denied. It'd be a surprise if they didn't. And they've been striking Kuwait and Bahrain very heavily, but Trump had threatened to strike their oil facilities, their oil capabilities. There was the 48-hour deadline, and then there was the request, of course, for the 48-hour ceasefire, which Iran rejected. And now, of course, the Kuwait petrochemical office and facility, huge high-rise building, has been struck by drones and is burning. Of course, other major, huge fuel storage and American bases in Kuwait have been struck, and Bapco and other big Bahraini, specifically oil storage units, have been blown up in apparently Iranian strikes, some of the biggest flaming infernos we've seen since the initial week of the war. So that seems to be the current huge escalation. Obviously, Trump is going to probably release a bunch more bluster and they will respond. But again, the escalation ladder isn't really in his hands anymore. The Israelis are the only ones really willing to use nukes, which they have the control over that. And at this point, troops have already been on the ground to rescue the soldier and the idea that troops would try to take these islands. Everyone should listen to our interview with Yaqub Saraf to hear his assessment. Again, defense minister of Lebanon understands the defense capabilities, the military realities in this region extremely well. It would be a slaughter. Any kind of ground operation, he said, would be a slaughter, just like the prophecies of Elder Joseph of Atopiti said. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these recent escalatory strikes from Iran, Dimitri. Obviously, the huge strikes on Israel that have been going down. If you have any updates on those targets, because those have been fascinating as well, please let us know how this is escalating and what you think the U.S. is going to do in response, because they've already hit the Iranian big bridge, which was the largest in the country. They've hit a few other key facilities. So everywhere in the region is just getting lit up right now.
Yeah, absolutely. The bridge attack was actually the largest attack against any sort of Iranian, you can call it civilian infrastructure, really. It was the largest bridge outside of Tehran to the northwest of the city. The bridge is confirmed to have been hit by the United States military. So it wasn't actually the Israelis who struck the bridge. And this is very key because the bridge is actually obviously just like the Kerch Bridge, which was attacked by the Israelis multiple times. It is in fact a highway used for civilian as well as military purposes, obviously, because you do have huge, trucks and things going over the bridge. And of course, the reports initially were that, look, we struck the bridge, which is a piece of civilian infrastructure, because there were military assets going over the bridge. Therefore, now apparently civilian infrastructure can also be damaged. It's a huge step in the wrong direction, I think, away from any potential ceasefire for the Americans and the Israelis to actually go down this road. And clearly, there has been a huge escalation. This combined with the Iranian retaliations striking at these energy infrastructures, or at least, economy-related sites in the Arab Gulf states. I think, Conrad, this does kind of draw the line of aggression into the spectrum of almost no coming back from this unless both sides sign some sort of comprehensive long-term peace adjustment deal, and they have to come to the table. This is entering into, obviously, a similar conflict to Russia-Ukraine, where you have oil refineries hit on all sides, electrical stations, for example, generators, even the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant being hit. And the Bushehr nuclear power plant, in fact, on the coast of Iran has also been threatened and has been, the outskirts of that have been struck. Potentially the nuclear site itself has been damaged. There's been reports of potentially nuclear waste going into the Persian Gulf if some severe damage was to be caused to the Bushehr nuclear power plant. So, in fact, yes, the Americans and the Israelis together have been already dealing severe damage to Iranian infrastructure. And that's why I mention this, is because Donald J. Trump, literally over the last 24 hours, he's tweeted officially that the 10-day deadline is coming to an end. Most likely, at least with the Roman Catholics and those on the Western Gregorian calendar, it will happen this Easter Monday. That 48-hour timeline is going to end. And in fact, as the markets open up, Donald J. Trump will either, again, give another deadline for the Iranians to actually stop bombing the allies in the Arab states and Israel, or potentially there will be an extension of that deadline. I think both cases are obviously plausible, especially now given the news we have about the F-15E pilot and weapons operator being rescued by the Americans, which I think is a really big deal, because I think diplomatically speaking...
Well, we have even more news, which is that apparently he has been rescued, in the sense that I guess a group has reached him, but they are still in Iranian territory and are not yet safe. So you all now know exactly when we are recording this, because we are getting the news live. So I guess maybe by the end of this recording, we'll have something worked out, but we'll see. Maybe these people will not make it out alive. So we'll be monitoring the situation, but sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
No, of course. The capacity for losses from the Americans is incredibly high. And also, I'd like to keep in mind, most of the American aerial losses, the MQ-9 Reaper drones, which at this rate, given it's the fifth week of combat, there's been at least 3 MQ-9 Reaper drones shot down every single week by the Iranians. And this is probably the largest number of MQ-9 Reaper drones shot down by any country. If you remember, these are the same drones that Obama used to kill civilians and alleged terrorists over the course of his presidency over the 8-year term. Remember when everyone was mentioning how Obama was droning people? He was using these exact drones, which are now obviously the pilots of which are well trained and well honed. They are now being utilized over the airspace of Iran. But I'd like to point out just the geographic, an interesting point is that it is basically western and southern Iran, and obviously the southwestern portion of Iran that we're seeing the most aerial combat in. And obviously most of the sorties, they do not go further eastwards than Tehran at the moment. It does appear that the northeastern sections of Iran are fairly safe. We don't hear about any major flights into those directions, although in the early days of the war, there was bombing of the Mashhad International Airport that was located over there, and some of the air bases of Iran. Potentially this is where the Russian helicopters and planes were stationed, fairly far away from the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz, in sort of safe areas that the US couldn't reach potentially, would have to go significantly deeper into Iranian territory or fly over, for example, the Caspian Sea in order to reach those locations. Clearly, I doubt Israelis would have the chutzpah to fly that deep into Iranian territory. But clearly, I think things have escalated to a point where we will have fresh reports, most likely from some of the losses of these recent conflicts on the ground. Now that the Americans, for the first time, as you said, Conrad, have had boots on the ground to extract this particular weapons operator pilot, and we'll have most likely a clearer picture of exactly how President Trump would like to use this for propaganda purposes, and how Pete Hegseth would like to, of course, authorize any sort of further strike, maybe using, again, those airborne and that Marine Expeditionary Force, which at this point well and truly are within the vicinity of CENTCOM, except we've heard pretty much no confirmation over the last 4 or 5 days. We know they're in the region. It's just, where exactly are they stationed? Where are those amphibian ships located? And how exactly will they operate in the near future? Will we see a drop-off point on one of the islands? Or will we see actually the amphibian ships try to breach the Straits of Hormuz, which would be extremely dangerous, especially at this point where even commercial ships are not obviously risking things, and they're not even, I would say, direct targets. If the Iranians see any of the American naval vessels, they will, of course, do their utmost to try and take them down. And obviously, they're key targets. And I did mention on previous episodes, this is maybe 50 episodes ago or so, there have been heaps of reports of aircraft being shot down in the Russo-Ukrainian war, perhaps with less details and less footage available to us. And because the war has been going on for so long, perhaps we've missed out on a lot of the details of exactly just how easy it is to shoot down these aircraft. The fact that this is the first time the Americans and CENTCOM have confirmed an aircraft has been clearly destroyed in the sky, well, 2 aircrafts if you count the Warthog as well, it shouldn't really surprise us. Even during the Prigozhin revolt itself in June of 2023, the Prigozhin Wagner forces took down at least 7 helicopters and the Russian equivalent of the AWACS. So the Russians also had this big radar plane flying in the air, the Ilyushin 22M, and the Wagner anti-air surface-to-air missile launcher actually destroyed the Russian equivalent of the AWACS. And the Russians also have less than 20 of those available in their entire Air Force air fleet. So that's how significant this Prince Sultan Air Base strike last week was. It was absolutely, and it was, shocking that the Americans had this massive aircraft just standing there unprotected, not in a defensive barracks or somewhere in a protected, insulated hangar. It's absolutely, people will need to answer for that, I think, because that's literally close to $1 billion of American taxpayer revenue simply wasted during the 3rd, 4th week of the war, which is completely insane, almost as if they're believing that Iran simply will not be striking at every single American base that they can get their crosshairs on. So that's incredibly surprising. And we did have reports from last year, which we mentioned in previous episodes, that in the Russo-Ukrainian war, obviously we know Ukrainian planes are getting shot down basically on a monthly basis, but the Russians also lost, at least this is reports from the front lines, not my words. Clearly there are no official reports, but at least 170 aircraft, helicopters, including Russian warplanes, have been shot down since the beginning of the war. So that's the numbers we're speaking about here. We should not be surprised that given Iran's capacity, Iran is a much mightier country than Ukraine. Clearly doesn't have the foreign support of Ukraine, but Iran's capacity to take down American aircraft, especially if they continuously every single night fly sorties over Iranian territories, the capacity for Iran to shoot them down is very, very plausible. This is not something out of the, this shouldn't really take us by surprise. And recall last week we mentioned the SA-67 missiles, those portable surface-to-air missiles, which literally could be brought around to any point and simply put together by 3 or 4 military operatives of Iran and fired into the air, and they could be carried around on the back of the Toyota pickup truck, for example. They don't need those massive 8-wheeler launchers or 6-wheeler launchers like you see the S-300, S-400 systems, or allegedly, Conrad, this is the biggest update, again, this is in the realm of hypotheticals, but apparently Russia has provided Iran with S-500 missile launcher systems. Those are the Prometheus new surface-to-air missile launchers. Now, these are massive 8-wheeler trucks. They have a huge heat signature, clear targets, especially if they're standing in unprotected territories. They do need radars to operate. And the query is, of course, why would Russia give this really new, it's a post-COVID anti-air defense system that Russia has developed. Why would they provide this to Iran, knowing that the Americans are flying essentially combat sorties over the airspace of Iran every single day for 5 weeks now, and they've been targeting anything that can get their sights on, really? Why would they provide this new high-end technology to Iran? I think if they really have provided a Prometheus S-500 air defense system, it would be for the purposes of actual live combat training to see how it fares against, the American aircraft to potentially utilize the same systems later on Russian territory, almost like a beta test, an experimental air defense tester against American aircraft, which in some capacity you can say are much better operated than some of those Ukrainian pilots would use their F-16s and F-15s in combat over the airspace of Eastern Europe. So it is quite interesting how we do have very clearly, like, at least if the rumors are true, Russia is clearly still providing all these technologies to Iran with the knowledge that potentially these technologies may be destroyed in combat. The benefit here is, Conrad, however, that even if the S-500 system is damaged, severely or destroyed on Iranian territory, there won't be like an extraction group of Americans dropping off to actually investigate it or to actually try to, for example, cross-design or steal certain parts from it to then, of course, design one for themselves. So the technological secrets of Russia will remain somewhere deep in Iranian territory if they do get damaged at all. So it is very curious that, it's for the first time perhaps in quite a while, we have confirmation that, American hardware was well and truly lost, and not just standing on the tarmac or in a hangar bay, for example, and on a base that's being attacked by long-range ballistic missiles, but actually running combat missions over the airspace of Iran in an offensive capacity, not defensively at all. And this obviously highlights the fact that, we've reached an escalation point where this has gone beyond just the peacekeeping operation, and well and truly it also shows the Americans, sort of inability to understand how the combat situation has reached the point where, yes, this potential weapons operator or the pilot from the Warthog, potentially they could have been captured if they, for example, had launched into the wrong direction, or perhaps even, the wind blew in the wrong direction. They could have been captured, and I don't think those consequences were calculated by either the president or his cabinet standing behind him, and what the consequences of American captors could have truly been. And we remember all of those absolutely horrific combat search and rescue operations in the past. For example, Operation Anaconda in March of 2002, which took place in Afghanistan. Just have a read about that. Or Operation Red Wings, which I think even an American movie came out about that in July 2005. That's insane operations where the Americans would send in these helicopters for, salvation, saving purposes of their American compatriots in the mountains of Afghanistan. And then the helicopters themselves would be damaged, pilots would be killed, air crew would be killed, really severe. And of course, the most famous famous combat search and rescue operation is, of course, by Hollywood standards, has been immortalized. The 1993 Battle of Mogadishu, when a Black Hawk helicopter went down in the middle of the city, and then the crew had to be extracted, which was absolutely insane. So I think those are not, the potential to see those sort of scenarios are not too far removed from us if we continue seeing, again, this sort of stalwart defensive posture of Iran, and actually forcing the Americans, as correctly put by some analysts, baiting them in deeper into their airspace where they could actually shoot them down with these really easy to launch missiles and stingers if they fly very low to the ground. And then, of course, capturing the pilots or forcing the Americans into these very daring and very risky search and rescue operations that will, again, lead to more casualties on the American side. And naturally, we don't hear about any Israelis assisting in these combat search and rescue operations. So I think that sort of explains exactly who is taking all of the risks and damage in these particular operations. Israel is managing its own affairs, clearly being bombed by 3 enemies at the moment, from the Houthis, the Iranians, and Hezbollah. But notice Israel really hasn't commented in terms of actually assisting the American pilots being hit by Iran recently. So that really says a lot.
No, it really does. And we're still getting more conflicting reports about this rescue operation. Some reporters are saying that it's all done and it's all out. Other people are saying that they don't know. There's reports that there are clashes, but again, all huge fog of war. Again, who knows that if this has all already been wrapped up and the U.S. is releasing information, or if it hasn't, who knows? Regardless, the fear at this point, like you mentioned, Black Hawk Down, Dimitri, is that if this is all said and done and it goes successfully, which ultimately I hope it does, I don't want to see anybody die, but we're going to get a huge Israeli, Jewish, American propaganda movie out of this about whatever daring operation supposedly did or did not go down, and we'll have no way of knowing whether or not what is relayed to us is the truth. But of course, the reason this is all being fought is because we have to fight this war, because if we weren't there, Israel would be facing the full brunt of these missile strikes and would have already been destroyed at this point. Some of the strikes on Israel have been pretty intense. Major blocks have been leveled, finally starting to feel some of the pain they've inflicted on Gaza, Lebanon, and elsewhere for the past few years. But there was a strike very close to the Israeli Ministry of Defense. There was a huge strike on the Neo Tovav industrial zone in Beersheba in southern Israel, which was likely targeting the Adama chemicals plant. There have been huge Hezbollah strikes on Kiryat Shmona, some really, really crazy videos from those strikes. And it's also clear that Ansar Allah, the Houthis, Iran, and Hezbollah are coordinating on some of their missile strikes because the Ansar Allah missiles have also been launched towards Eilat and these other regions in southern Israel as the Iranian strikes have rained down as well. So coordinated fronts here. The Iraqi militias have also been escalating their strikes on American bases. They strike the ones in Kuwait as well. Again, as we were recording this, more drone strikes continue to strike the Waring base in Kuwait, which has now been effectively completely destroyed because they face joint strikes from the Iraqi PMF militias and Iran. The Iraqi PMF militias are losing a lot of commanders from U.S. strikes, that's for sure, though. They're becoming probably the most struck target outside of Iran itself by U.S.-Israeli forces because they're making things so hard. I mean, they've driven Americans entirely out of Iraq, and only a few remain in Erbil and Kurdistan, and they come under heavy strikes from Iran and Iraq every single day. And Kuwait, of course, again, people are wondering, why is Iran attacking Kuwait and the UAE so hard? Because, well, the UAE is basically openly talking about invading Iran with the United States. They've used their own Chinese drones that have now been shot down over Iran, effectively an act of war in and of itself. In Kuwait, we had video evidence this week of ATACMS missiles being launched from Kuwaiti territory towards Iran. So, of course, those bases and wherever those are happening are now legitimate targets. And, of course, the Kuwaiti petrochemical is some of the most tied in, of course, with the United States and America's threats and the already carried out Israeli strikes on some of Iran's largest petrochemical facilities, like the one in Mashhar, which is the largest petrochemical complex in all of Iran, and have now effectively been forced to halt production. That's at least according to the New York Times. The article goes on to say the attack hit two key utility plants, Fajr 1 and Fajr 2, which supply gas, electricity, and industrial water to more than 50 facilities within the complex, disrupting their ability to operate. The two oil ministry officials said the plant's total shutdown was a blow to Iran's already frail economy, adding that rebuilding the utility plants and bringing the production lines fully online again could take about 2 years. So now that that's already gone down, every energy facility in the Gulf region and Israel are now up for grabs for Iran. And it appears that Kuwait and Bahrain and Israel have become the first victims of that. I'm sure the UAE facilities, I think I did see a strike there as well. So many strikes, it's really hard to carry on and keep up with all the strikes every single day. But we have breaking, it says, American F-15 crew member rescued and safe after complex rescue operation that began Friday morning. 2 senior U.S. officials confirm to Fox News. So it appears we will be learning more about this again by the time an hour more into this recording. We might be bringing you more details. This is why it's very stressful trying to find time to record and do streams in the midst of World War III, because news breaks throughout the hour by the minute as we record the show. But alas, that's what we're here for. So, there are worse things that can happen, right, than a lot of news for a news show to cover. But you mentioned all of the civilian strikes, Dimitri, on the bridge. And actually, really, before I say that, I want to make sure I talk about those Iraqi militias. The Iraqi militias are not just really helping Iran in their strikes and driving out the Americans. They've even been going into Iran to help with civilian infrastructure and maintaining of law and order, and potentially to defend against ground invasions. Huge convoys of Iraqi PMF Shia militiamen were seen crossing into Iran from Iraq, and they came under heavy U.S.-Israeli strike as those convoys were crossing the border regions. So very, very fascinating regional developments. And it's clear they have some freedom of navigation across the entire country now that the Americans have been entirely driven out of Iraq. So really, really interesting things to see. You would never hear something like that in Iraq into Iran happening before this war broke out. But you mentioned the bridge, Dimitri, and many people, I think I might have retweeted, I can't remember if I did or not, but the architect behind this bridge, the tallest bridge in Iran that you said was 8 or is it 13 now, I believe, civilian casualties in the midst of these Jewish strikes on this, again, piece of immense civilian infrastructure. And the architect, he was on the news and he's talking about how if God sees fit to allow him to live through this war and to not be martyred, then he will happily build the bridge again and again, and he will build it stronger, and he will make sure that it can be used by the people of Iran. It's something that struck me about the interview, and people can laugh at this, I guess, but even laughing at this sort of betrays the sort of attitude that I'm about to condemn, which is, I'm sorry, but like people in America don't feel, who cried when the Key Bridge got destroyed by Indian tankers? Who thought that was, who's stepping up to fix that? It's going to take decades to fix that thing, it sounds like. Really, all sorts of these things happen, and nobody is, when do you get the sense of people think about it? Your job, your congressman, your city councilman, even your HOA president, the principal of your local public school even. Do these people really, have you ever gotten the sense that these people are doing their job or fulfilling their place in society or stepping up to their duty for the sake of the society as a whole? Of course not. At best, you could say they're doing it for, their church, their religion, their specific ideology or something like that. But in Iran, they've built this society. They had this revolution. They've maintained this ethos. They've built this integrated religious, political sense of identity that an Iranian can have, especially if you're a Shia 12er. And this guy, he was crying. He was crying that the bridge had been destroyed and that it wasn't, that his work that he worked so hard for his society wasn't going to be used for the betterment of the Islamic Republic. And that's how you can you understand that attitude. That's how you can understand that Iran is able to stand in this war. And again, I'm not saying that I don't love my country, but from an objective perspective, I've already made it clear I'm rooting for Iran in this war. They are a nobler civilization than us. They have a more metaphysical, deeper understanding of self. They have a deeper understanding of who their people around them are and who they are as a nation. And that's why you could have somebody who just a random architect. He's not the supreme leader. He's not Ali Larijani, all these guys with their Kantian and Hegelian papers and their multilingualism and high academic IQs and whatnot. The guy was an architect. I'm sure very smart. He built the largest bridge in Iran, and he feels a sense of martyric duty to his country, and seeing it be destroyed inspires him to build more for his country, not for his personal enrichment or betterment, but for this greater idea. And unfortunately, the West just doesn't have anything like that. And until we re-Christianize our societies and more people take a deeper look at their faith and accept the Holy Spirit at a much more foundational level of their being than we are currently witnessing, then we're never going to be able to have that kind of attitude. And of course, that's why Iran is able to stand up against this. Of course, we're facing a different battle, but how could we expect to stand up against the Jewish menace replacing us and destroying us in our home if we don't have this same kind of love and devotion and single-minded dedication to, God, nation? They have their supreme leader. We don't have any kings here in the West. You can have King Charles, who's the head of the Freemasons and, is more into Islam than he is into Easter. He's more into Diwali and these other things and all these other brown person holidays. So it just shows you what a rightly ordered society can do, even with the wrong religion ostensibly, but then with how they've structured it is able to withstand the full force of the Jewish American empire throwing everything it can at it just because of the ideas that they believe in. And that's something that I think a lot of people could learn from. And again, think of the Christian empire with that ethos behind it. Think of Orthodox Russia with a czar. Think of Orthodox Georgia with a king. Think of Orthodox Greece or with an emperor in Constantinople with that attitude. The Jews wouldn't have a chance. The forces of darkness would be trembling in their boots because God would finally be able to say to us, "Well done, my good and faithful servant," instead of what we're seeing with Pete Hegseth as he fires army generals left and right, supposedly because they disagree with his vision of basically being a crusader state for Zion, Israel, in the name of Jesus Christ, which again, fighting in the name of the Zionist entity is not the Jesus that I know, because the current inhabitants of the Zionist entity, their ancestors are the ones that put Christ to death. So that's the reality of the situation there. We're getting reports that the Iranians have been fighting against certain sects of Balochi separatists. I don't know if that's American interference or if it's just some Balochis seeing an opportunity, but it wouldn't surprise me. Obviously, they've been even more violent in some capacity than the Kurds and Azeris in certain revolutionary activity. We have a report here from Fox News' Jennifer Griffin, the chief national security correspondent for Fox News, reports that the operation to rescue the missing navigator of the F-15E of the 494th Fighter Squadron ended in success. Fox News can confirm that the second crew member of the downed F-15E fighter jet has been rescued, and he and the members of the rescue team that extracted him from behind enemy lines in Iran are all safely out of Iran. That according to two senior U.S. officials and multiple well-placed sources in the region, the weapons system officer ejected along with the pilot when their F-15E Strike Eagle was flying was struck Thursday night, early Friday local time in southwest Iran. The WSO used the SERE survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training to evade capture, hiding on an elevated ridge after hiking away from the wreckage and putting out an emergency beacon. U.S. Special Operations Rescue Forces, to include PJs, United States Air Force, para-rescuemen, and many layers of elite rescue forces took part in the complex layered mission to both find the crew member and also keep the Iranian forces who were hunting the American weapons system operator at bay. There are videos that have appeared from local eyewitnesses that show what appears to have been injured and dead Iranian members of the IRGC and Basij who were looking for the downed American crew member. Fox has learned there was fighting on the ground, but no Americans killed during the operation. It was a very complex operation to retrieve the downed service member. A well-placed source briefed on the operation told me many different branches of the U.S. military were involved in the rescue. Fox News can confirm the A-10 Warthog that crashed Friday was involved in providing cover for the rescue teams, which we said on the show, searching for the pilot. The A-10 crashed in Kuwait, first reported by ABC Friday, but the A-10 pilot managed to eject safely and was rescued. There was destruction of aircraft, which have sensitive equipment on board, I'm told, all part of the complex search and rescue mission. The F-15E was pretty much destroyed on impact. 2 rescue helicopters were hit by enemy fire on Friday, and crew members on board were injured by enemy fire but managed to take it out of Iran. There were a lot of elements to this rescue, I am told. Again, that's the initial broad report that we have that we just sent to you. I'm sure that will probably be the official story that the U.S. is running with from here on out. Will we ever really know if there were 0 casualties taken by the United States? Of course not. But if they do have the airman himself and they can prove that it's the same guy that was in the plane, you can probably safely say there wasn't necessarily too much destruction. But again, hey, maybe on the way out they had to lose a lot of bodies. We'll really never know. But fascinating story there. So it's now been confirmed we will be getting a Jewish movie about this in the next 5 years, maybe sooner. They already have October 7th movies. So we will be getting Escape from Iran very, very soon. Hey, maybe this pilot's Jewish himself. That would make it even better for them. But we'll find out. It seems to be male. They seem to be indicating that, but that seems to be the current story. But unless you have any takes on what just unfolded, Dimitri, we probably also need to talk about the potential for ground operations in the Hormuz Strait itself, what's going on there, Karg Island, Keshem Island. Yaqub Saraf, he gave a good take on that. Like I said, everyone needs to check that out. But before we talk about the ground invasion of Lebanon, which is where the most intense ground operations of the war are currently ongoing, we have to talk about the Straits itself and the invasion. But feel free to react to the latest F-15 news as well.
Obviously, the F-15 news is huge because the Americans, for one, the American military, CENTCOM, they've actually confirmed it, and clearly they're actually giving information. Yeah, they did delay any sort of official confirmations that the plane was even shot down in the first place by several hours, probably to give, because most likely the airplane was shot down at nighttime, and they wanted to give the search and rescue crews a head start, to try and find them without confirming. And also, some of the prior reports by Iran in the first few hours did in fact indicate that they in fact shot down an F-35, which later turned out to be an F-15E. And, to be fair, it is very difficult if they did shoot it down at night to actually make out exactly what was flying above overhead. And there are well and truly F-35s carrying out sorties over Iran as well. So you can't really blame the Iran, I think, at this point. If there is any American plane flying overhead over your sovereign territory, it is, from the Iranian perspective, a legitimate target. So really making a mistake at this point is not really that crucial. I think what's really surprising, I think, Conrad, even ahead of some of the news that, potentially there will be a ground invasion. People are talking about Balochistan, for example. There's hypotheticals thrown out by geopolitical analysts claiming that, island of Keshem needs to be taken out, turned into a base, Karg Island. Although I have to say there has been a lot of pushback over the last fortnight or so, the last 14 days. There's been a lot of analysts coming out and saying that, well, Karg Island, despite its economic utility to Iran, really it is, a fish in a barrel type of position for the Americans, whether it be the Marine Expeditionary Force or the airborne elites dropped off there. It will be a futile operation to try and hold that particular island against the Iranians, who at this point seem to have this position of utilizing their long-range drones as well as ballistic missiles to deal as much damage to any bases or defensive positions of the Americans anywhere in the Middle East, really, at this point. So if the Americans do take Karg Island, I think that we can almost guarantee that the Iranians will be striking them. And so how long do they have to hold Karg Island and be besieged in this particular position? Again, to hold the Chinese hostage, I mean, that probably won't work. As you've probably learned since the last week, we've discussed the potential, hypothetical that, well, Karg Island's oil exports primarily go to China, but China has at least 150, 200 days worth of crude oil stored up from years of actually preparing for a conflict of this scale. So could the Americans survive, sitting on this island for 100 days? I mean, that sounds like, a very tragic movie in and of itself. And I think in preparation of actually, getting the Americans morally prepared to, again, put further boots on the ground to actually commit troops for this sort of sacrificial expedition to secure the Straits of Hormuz primarily, I think, Conrad, we did see some very bizarre dismissals by the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, actually this week. And the 3 key commanders that were dismissed were, of course, the chief of the U.S. Army, so a super high-ranking position. This man is Of course, we're speaking about General Randy A. George. He was dismissed from his position directly by Pete Hegseth. He, of course, is the crowning figure here. He is a veteran of both the Gulf Wars because he, of course, joined the military back in 1988, if I'm not mistaken. He's been involved in the first war against Iraq in 1991. Again, the 2003 Operation Iraqi Freedom. He was participating in that. So he has a clear knowledge and, of course, a direct experience fighting in the Persian Gulf, fighting against the America's enemies, let's just call it that way, in the Middle East. He has a clear military experience, and yet Pete Hegseth, of course, dismisses him, and he also dismisses two other figures. David Hodney, the head of Army Futures Training and Transformation Command, he was dismissed alongside General George. And the other position, I think, Conrad, you'll find this one curious, is the chief of Army chaplains, held by, of course, an African-American, Pastor William Green Jr. Now, the interesting thing is Pastor William Green Jr., in fact, is not an evangelical Christian. This African-American pastor is Baptist, from what I could understand. So that perhaps could throw a wrench in the sort of glorification of the war for Iran. I mean, Baptists are, some of them are pro-Zionist, others, of course, are more on the fence, but this is not an evangelical Pete Hegsethian sort of pastorhood, perhaps. And he was appointed, I believe, in 2023, so under the Biden administration. So that's perhaps the excuse being used, or that will be used in the next few weeks, to sort of explain why Pete Hegseth is ordering a reshuffling of the top military positions in the middle of, well, what you can call a special combat operation from the American perspective, but literally it's another Middle Eastern war. It's a very strange time to be doing that. And the only thing I think we can say directly at this point, having such little news in relation to the dismissals and the reasoning behind that, is probably it's because they've had, I think, some systemic disagreements with some of the leadership decisions being carried out by the Trump administration, as well as Pete Hegseth directly as the new Secretary of War. And I think they had some clear reservations, most likely, especially the chief of Army chaplains and maybe even General George himself, about the ability of America to hold the Straits of Hormuz for some long duration of time, similar to how, of course, the Straits of Gibraltar are held by the British, or some of the Straits of the Suez Canal, for example, was held by the French, and obviously the British had some say in that. All of these particular key straits and economic positions for the Americans to be permanently, perhaps after a ground operation, holding the Straits of Hormuz going into the future will place, I think, American lives at severe risk. I mean, it's almost worse than having military bases in a place like Afghanistan, which was riddled with suicide bombers and radical Pashtuns who really just hate America and everything it stands for. I mean, from even a traditional sort of Taliban radical Salafi perspective, the fact that the Americans have already been carrying out, strikes which have led to over 3,000 casualties in Iran, plus they're trying to escalate to have boots on the ground, whether it's in Balochistan or in the Straits of Hormuz themselves. I think there'll clearly be heavy disagreements at the top of the military. So I think this really just shows that, we didn't see anything like this, Conrad, in the first year of the war, in the special military operation. We did see, of course, the dismissal of General Surovikin after Prigozhin's revolt, but that was well and truly 12 months into the conflict itself. The Russian army, of course, there were sanctions and there were military personnel moved around, shuffled around, but there were no clear dismissals of this kind that would indicate that the Russian army was not united behind a particular cause. So this potentially shows this unity amongst the top minds of the American military industrial complex machine. And of course, this is quite important. We also recall that the Israelis themselves, after an entire year of the Gaza operation and the massacres and the genocide being carried out there were also Israelis who were resigning from the Air Force, from military defense positions, even the defense minister himself. So it clearly just shows that at the end of the day, we're all made in the image of God. And I think some of these clear military people, despite all their training and perhaps conditioning that they have mentally, preparing them for warfare, of course, their entire lives are based on training and preparing the American military to go in to carry out these combat operations. They do have a conscience. And I think their conscience is telling them that this war of aggression cannot be justified in any way. And of course, the tens of thousands of American troops potentially in the first wave being sent to either Karg Island, Keshem, Hormuz Island, or any of these, or God forbid, Bandar Abbas, the city of 500,000 people with, where everybody has mobile phones, everyone's connected to the internet. There will be, there is no combat secrecy. Once the Americans land, there will be Iranian civilians, of course, in 4K filming their positions and posting them onto the internet if possible, connecting at home to their Wi-Fis and actually revealing their positions to the enemies. We know what drone swarms are like in Russia, Ukraine. We remember the horrific footage being released predominantly by the Ukrainians, of their drones chasing down Russian infantrymen all over the sort of the wastelands of Zaporozhye or the Donetsk People's Republic oblasts. We may see similar footage on Keshem Island or Karg Island with Iranian drones, of course, chasing down Americans. I mean, nobody wants to see that, so we do have to just take into account when the decision is made for boots on the ground, whoever gives that blessing will be essentially taking the responsibility for sending Americans into this, I think, inevitably perilous situation at this point. And thereafter, when there are, God forbid, hundreds of Americans dead, who can really say that the Americans will sit down at the negotiating table and then call for a ceasefire? I think, if anything, there's only one particular direction the situation can go into, Conrad, and that is escalate further and more and more and more. Get that 450 kilograms of enriched uranium out of the base, drop deeper into Iranian territory into these futile, incredibly risky and daring operations, which no doubt the Americans, they do have the courage and the bravery to do so. But what are they doing it for? Iran has never threatened the United States. They're doing it all for Israel, and that's the saddest part of the entire of these, hearing about the A-10 Warthog being shot down or the F-15E or the F-35 being hit, that it's all being done essentially for a foreign country which controls not just the culture but also a lot of the economic connections in the US, most likely the country itself from Washington, D.C. directly, as we see through Chabad, Lubavitch, and other sects. So it really is that perilous situation where America's entering into the Third World War on the wrong side. And yet, I mean, everyone in the West has always been given this image of America being the good guys, bringing freedom, bringing peace to any of these regions. And yet America now is bringing the opposite of peace. It's destroying infrastructure. Trump, in the next 24 to 48 hours, is going to make, I think, a very concrete statement, given the bombings of the Gulf countries. Civilian infrastructure will begin getting hit across Iran. And, several weeks thereafter, we'll see horrific humanitarian consequences on the mainland, be it around Bandar Abbas, the territories that the Americans will capture. So the tens of thousands, if not under 20,000 troops that will be dropped off in the first wave, will they be providing any support, any sort of medical assistance to the locals who are hurt by the bombing raids or the combat therein? I doubt it very much. I mean, how many engineering groups will the Americans drop to create defensive positions on whichever island they choose to take? What exactly will the Americans be even doing in those particular positions? Because he's simply sitting on the island of Karg, Keshem, or even taking the city of Bandar Abbas, or anywhere on the coast of Balochistan and Sistan, will not bring around any immediate results. I think the Iranians understand the longer the war goes on, similar to, of course, Afghanistan and Vietnam, they know by principle that the Americans, I think, do not have that long-lasting morale, whether it's at home or even among the troops, as we saw in the Jaralat Ford, with the very suspicious infrastructural malfunctions going on that aircraft carrier, that the Americans will have what it takes to really withstand the multi-year conflict. I mean, it's very different to the Russo-Ukrainian war, where each side had perhaps somewhat incorrect and twisted, but the Russians had the opinion that they were defending Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea against the Ukrainians and fighting against neo-Nazism, etc. The Ukrainians had this perspective of, we are fighting a defensive war against the aggressor Putin. In this particular war, what exactly are the Americans going to be fighting for on these islands or in these desolate locations where you have these Shahed drones flying in, or God forbid, even FPV drones flying at them? It's very mysterious. And look, if we have to analyze every bit of news to actually have a handle on what exactly the motivations of the elites are, I doubt the jarheads and the American elites, even the airborne troopers, as smart as they may be, will have any sort of ability to analyze in the moment when they're under gunfire what exactly they're dying, being injured for, being intended to dursote, as the Russians like to say, is carrying out severe, grievous injuries on the front lines. I mean, all of this moral weight is going to be on the shoulders of whoever makes that decision to send the American troops in. But yes, the craziest thing is CENTCOM at the moment, all the pressure's on that particular command, wherever it's stationed at the moment, and they will be making the call, I think, very soon in order to apply that additional pressure to Iran. So the next week is going to be very crucial as to where the combat will go.
No, very true. As far as CENTCOM headquarters, obviously Israel is a command center. Brad Cooper, head of CENTCOM, head of the military Joint Chiefs of Staff and everything, he was in Israel. Obviously, there's going to be major bunkers and operations there, but I think a lot of the operations are also coming from the west coast of Saudi Arabia on the Red Sea, somewhat farther away from Iranian missiles there. So that's the update, of course, on top of Randy George, Major General William Green, as well as a Commanding General of Army Transformation and Training Command, David Hodney, were fired by Hegseth as well. Apparently last year, Hegseth also fired Air Force Lieutenant General Jeffrey Cruz, as well as several others. And I've heard that this guy, as well as some of the people fired in the past 2 days by Hegseth, were generally against the operations in Iran. Not saying these were anti-war or anti-Israel guys. These were just people that were skeptical of this operation. And I think Hegseth and Trump didn't trust them not to leak. And they want somebody that's going to just completely take orders and probably have the same Zog Third Temple vision that Hegseth and evidently Trump seem to have adopted for this war, because obviously this is a religious war of existence and eschatology for the Shia Islamic Republic. So America, we've got to come up with our own version of that, and that is to defend Israel, rebuild the Third Temple, and bring back the Antichrist. So that's what we're dealing with there. But you talk about the ground operations and who's going to support this. It seems that, again, with the firing of these guys, a lot of people are saying it's pretty much already been locked in. I believe, obviously, from the Jewish grand strategy perspective, this was planned years ago, but from the perspective of immediately convincing the people that have to press the button to say go and send these people to die for the Jews, I think that decision has been made, and these new people that are going to be coming in are going to be fully on board with that and ready to prove themselves to their bosses as their first official operations here in epic Reddit bacon fury as they attack Iran. They're going to be ready to go in with, all in, I guess you could say. So we're going to be waiting for that. But again, I think this is going to be a bloodbath. They're going to, again, they might try to make it surprising. It might be something that we don't see coming right now, and they do a little bit of something to make it think they're going into Karg or Keshem, and then they surprise us with something in Balochistan or something like that. Who knows? But again, if there's any significant deployment of American troops on the ground on an island, on the mainland, or really anywhere near the Iranian border, it is going to be a bloodbath. And whether that means they encounter troops on the ground, what will more likely happen is they will simply face intense missile strikes before they're even able to get anywhere, as well as mines and other booby traps that could be laid all across any suspected areas. So that's the situation there. And the Strait of Hormuz, the United States and Israel have both released assessments saying that they have no idea how long it will take to open the straits, and the Iranians apparently have no intention of opening it anytime soon. As of the time of recording, WTI crude, Brent crude, Murban crude are all around 110, a little bit over dollars. Apparently, these prices are somewhat being manipulated and played down. I've heard reports that the actual prices when people have to buy these barrels in port is already up to as high as $130, depending on where you're getting it. So, of course, the attempts by Trump to manipulate the market are starting to fall more and more flat as people realize he's just talking out of his ass. So I think we're going to see these numbers continue to fly up. And of course, we're already having fuel rationing in the UK and Europe, major lines and work from home and restrictions on driving all across Southeast Asia. Australia is running out of fuel. So, of course, in the next few weeks, Europe is really going to be the one that's hit. And then in another month, there's going to be parts of America that are going to be looking just as bad as Europe. So I'm glad I live in Texas these days. It's one of the better places to be for energy independence for obvious reasons. But it doesn't mean everything else doesn't get more expensive when fuel prices go up, because everything moves with the same fuel. So we're bracing for major economic downturn. There's all sorts of other economic metrics. The AI bubble is probably going to pop amidst all of this. And there's all sorts of other housing things similar to 2008 that are probably going to go kaput here. So I think at this point, the war has been going on too long to put this cat back in the bag. And of course, in the Strait of Hormuz, the evidence towards Iran not backing down anytime soon is their new transit system. This is from the Cradle. It says Iran has formally started enforcing a controlled transit system in the Strait of Hormuz, requiring ships to undergo vetting and pay fees for safe passage, according to a report by Bloomberg on April 1st. The report describes a system managed by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, where vessels must submit their detailed information, including ownership, cargo, and crew, to an intermediary for review. Ships are then screened for links to the U.S., Israel, or other states Tehran considers hostile, with only those cleared permitted to proceed under escort through a coastal corridor dubbed the Iranian Toll Booth. And I believe this is explicitly between Keshem and Larak Islands, a very thin little passage that they can keep tabs on. It says once terms of passage are agreed, ships receive a permit code and designated route, which they must broadcast to Iranian patrol boats upon approach. Iran's parliament has already approved a draft law introducing transit fees and restrictions on vessels linked to the U.S., Israel, and sanctioned states, pending final ratification. Negotiations over transit fees reportedly follow approval, with oil tankers typically charged from around $1 per barrel and payments made in Chinese yuan or stable coins, cryptocurrencies pegged to hard value currencies. With some tankers carrying up to or above 2 million barrels of crude, total costs can scale significantly, with at least one tanker having paid around $2 million to secure passage so far. Iranian economist Hossein Raghfar projects Tehran could secure up to $60 billion annually by formalizing transit tariffs across the strait, describing control of the waterway as a very powerful tool that has shifted economic leverage in Iran's favor. Meanwhile, Iran's oil sector is benefiting from the U.S.-Israeli war, with revenues rising as global prices surge and exports continue largely uninterrupted. Revenues from Iranian light crude rose to about 139 million per day in March, while exports held near 1.6 million barrels per day, even as other Gulf producers face disruption. Several governments, including India, Pakistan, Iraq, Malaysia, China, are in direct talks with Tehran to coordinate vessels through the system. So India is buying Iranian crude oil for the first time in 9 years because of the situation. They're extremely dependent on Gulf energy, obviously, with the largest population in the world and not an energy independent resource to tap out of. So that's obviously going to be a huge market that Iran has opened up to it. But now that, as we reported earlier, the huge strikes on the Iranian refineries and petrochemical industry are going to increase, we might start to see those profits go down because they're going to face production disruptions. And of course, if Karg Island gets destroyed, that's going to be a major blow to what is now quickly becoming Iran's savior cash flow, as I'm sure they're going to be suffering economically in the midst of total war being waged upon them. So the potential ground operation has yet to launch, could launch any day. You know that when it does, there's a good chance we will go live, at the very least on X or somewhere, if not on Substack, YouTube, all the places that you know and love. But unless you have anything else to say about the Straits, Iran itself, the Gulf, these other countries, Dimitri, of course, desal plants in the UAE and Kuwait have been hit. So the populations there are in for a rude awakening. Most of those countries are entirely reliant on desal. Iran, in response to the bridge that was struck, have decided to strike other bridges in the region. So we'll probably see the King Sultan Saudi Bahrain base completely blown up, bridge completely blown up, and then a full Shia takeover of Bahrain and overthrow of the Sunni Khalifa, unpopular monarchy there, can fully take place. So Bahrain, we already have seen Iraq, Kuwait might be taken over soon. So a lot of these countries, they might start to totally flip to the point where they'll be on the Iranian side once again. So unless you have any thoughts on that, Dimitri, we definitely need to talk about Lebanon, where Israel is taking heavy losses. As Yaqub Saraf, again, former Lebanese defense minister, said in our episode with him, they really have only been able to advance 8, 9, 10 kilometers deep into Lebanon in most of these places, these towns they've taken. So the resistance is fierce. At this point, hundreds of Merkava tanks have been struck by FPV drones, small anti-tank missiles, and other light arms fire. Hezbollah has been enforcing major ambush attacks have taken place. So let us know what's going on, Dimitri, in Lebanon as the resistance fiercely fights back. Israel fails to advance. It was actually just a few days ago, I think it was yesterday even. From here, it says, Israel's army scraps goal of disarming Hezbollah in Lebanon occupation. The Israeli military has issued statements today indicating that the war goal of fully disarming Hezbollah, initially presented as the entire pretext for the invasion of southern Lebanon last month, is being dropped on the grounds that it is unrealistic to think they'd be able to accomplish the goal and not required for the war to be won. What's the new pretext? Ultimately, the occupation of Lebanon South seems to now be an end unto itself, with the goal of invading and occupying the area south of the Litani River, now to create an occupied buffer zone south of that river. Army officials said they need to be modest about what can be accomplished militarily, and fully disarming Hezbollah would require conquering the whole of Lebanon, something that is not planned. So this means the Israelis are taking crazy casualties. To read between the lines here, they're something they realize they can't sustain, and they got to get in there, try to hold the territory as much as they can. You know, they much prefer to be police rather than military, right? The Israelis are not brave fighters. They're not strong, tall, Aryan people or anything like that. They are rat-like strategists who can manipulate markets and economies as well as emotions and passions. So they prefer to occupy an area and then impose military police, genocide-like conditions. We've seen videos from the West Bank recently where Israeli settlers, they storm Palestinian shops and just destroy everything inside the shop with masks. They storm Palestinian farms and slaughter all of the animals. And the IDF just watches along, of course. Of course, they don't always attack the people themselves and claim, oh, we didn't assault anybody. We just, we destroyed property that was on our land, and the IDF recognizes this. So they much prefer a military police state as opposed to an actual active front line, because in an active front line, you get the Radwan fighters and people that are willing to actually die for what they believe in and kill all these Israelis that are invading their territories. So that's why they have to disarm their population and rule over them like the footstool goyim that the Jews view them to be. And of course, southern Lebanon, again, gotta listen to the episode with Yaqub Saraf. He explains exactly why Israel needs southern Lebanon for its water, for its arable land, and for many other strategic points in the greater Israel project. So I'd love to hear, sorry, I have to keep reading this article. It says, Notably, Defense Minister Israel Katz continued to insist that the whole goal of the war is to disarm Hezbollah in comments earlier in the day, in the context of vowing that the invasion of Lebanon would continue irrespective if the Iran war was resolved. In the course of laying out their new occupation-centric policy, officials indicated that the goal was to level any Lebanon villages that the IDF believes have been hosting Hezbollah activities, including effectively every village immediately along the Blue Line. In recent days, the indication is that the war's focus is increasingly on Lebanese demographics. IDF officials have sought to reassure Lebanese Christians and Druze that they will be allowed to return to the occupied South, while warning them pointedly not to host any Shiites who were expelled from other villages. The occupied region is among the largest Shiite homelands in the country. Lebanon is a heavily multi-faith country, 32% Shiite, 31% Sunni, 16% Maronite, 10% Orthodox, blah, blah, blah. It goes on, but you guys get the picture. The invasion of Lebanon is fully underway. And again, while they justify it by saying we have to go in and disarm these terrorists that have been launching missiles at us, launching missiles, of course, in defense. They don't mention that, but so we have to go in and disarm them. Then they realize they're getting destroyed and facing heavy casualties and losing millions of dollars worth of tanks. They're like, all right, now we just got to occupy this whole area and genocide the people here and clear them out, just like the Palestinians. So that's what we're witnessing right now. Dimitri, I'd love to hear your perspective.
No, it's absolutely insane what's happening in Lebanon because we're clearly seeing another Gaza 2.0 operation. In fact, it is a bit surprising that the Israelis selected the south of Lebanon as their target before even any further incursions into the West Bank. But we have to consider the slow burn genocide happening in the West Bank never really slowed down. There's still close to 1,000 people that have been killed since October 7th there, and there's constant pressure by both the government and the radical Zionist settlers, which are always, applying pressure to the regular Palestinians, the natives of the land living there in the West Bank region of Palestine. But southern Lebanon is fairly extreme. What we've seen is the Israeli indiscriminate bombing by the Israeli Air Force, which is probably why, Conrad, you've noticed there's been less airstrikes against Iran reported from the Israeli Air Force, because I think they're mostly focusing the brunt of their Air Force bombers onto the Hezbollah, which, if Israel is actually having to, of course, report internally, that is, losses on the South Lebanese front, I mean, most likely they're going to direct all of their ire and fury onto the Lebanese people and Hezbollah in particular. So we have been seeing actually United Nations peacekeepers being killed as well, which frankly, the peacekeepers are there exactly for that very purpose, to keep Israel and to keep Hezbollah sort of separated, to keep them at bay, and yet that's not really working. In fact, Indonesia just 1 day ago received the bodies of 3 of their United Nations peacekeepers, which have arrived in coffins actually back home to Indonesia, one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, actually. I think it is the largest Muslim in the country in the world in terms of population. And they're, of course, mourning the loss of these servicemen who, again, Indonesia sent out to support the Muslim as well as the native populations of Lebanon. But Israel does not care. They continue to bomb, indiscriminately. There's been a southern Lebanese hospital that was damaged, and Israel, amidst the hospital bombing, there were 2 girls who were, again, killed in that particular bombing exactly. Every single day, there's massive bomb strikes, especially at nighttime, over any territory located south of the Litani River. But correctly put, I think anything south of Beirut really is being hit quite intensely. There's many, many injuries. Lebanese hospitals are actually overfilled with injured civilians, and military hospitals, no doubt, in Lebanon proper are being actually really put to the test. But Israel's primary target, it appears, whilst their ground operation is sort of inching forward at a snail pace, which really shows that Hezbollah has had 2 decades to prepare since the 2006 war, which I think many do consider that Hezbollah in Lebanon actually won against Israel. Hezbollah has prepared, and they, as you said correctly, Conrad, just like on Keshem and Karg, no doubt the Iranians are preparing similar defensive positions against the Americans, setting up booby traps, mines, all these other things. Hezbollah has done the same in southern Lebanon. And the Lebanese people, which very interesting, despite the risks to the population south of the Litani River, hundreds of thousands of people living there, the people are just not leaving. Although there are threats that, look, if every single bridge over the Litani River will be destroyed, there'll be people isolated in the Bekaa Valley, there's going to be a humanitarian crisis. There's a reporter from Al Jazeera, Abaida Hito, who says, if these bridges over the Litani are destroyed, it will essentially isolate the western Bekaa from the rest of Lebanon. It will make it extremely difficult for people trying to cross into the western Bekaa Valley and reach the main hub of Shutura, to reach hospitals and other public services. There's just basic journalistic fervor to try and get these messages across, specifically to, mind you, these journalists are reporting in the English language for Al Jazeera, because they're trying to actually put the message out that Israel is trying to, in some way, depopulate south of the Litani River, turn it into a no man's land. Similar, and again, Hezbollah is doing the same approach to northern Israel to try and deter the Israelis from invading their own homeland. But the Israelis, of course, have a lot more firepower than Hezbollah does. And yes, they're invading both on the ground and by air, bombing as many sites as possible to make it as extremely inhospitable for any of the regular Lebanese people, even those who aren't members of Amal or Hezbollah or any of these militant paramilitary groups, to actually remain in this particular territory, to turn it into this very large buffer zone. I think one of the Israeli-Russian journalists, actually, when he was being questioned on the Lebanese issue and Israeli aggression on Russian television, he said, well, he tried to make the comparison of Russia setting up a buffer zone in Kharkov or Sumskaya Oblast. He said, well, that's what the Israelis are doing south of the Litani River. So the Israelis have a very Machiavellian view of what exactly they're trying to do, at the very least. If not occupy south of the Litani River, they're going to turn it into a desolate zone in which Lebanese regular villages will need to, of course, abandon and move north. It'll cause a huge displacement of peoples. It is a local genocide, if you think about it, especially by territory. It's a much larger scale invasion than what we saw after the 7th of October in the Gaza Strip. You can almost say that the Israeli military were in fact practicing using their military forces as warming up against Hamas and the groups in the Palestinian Gaza Strip. And now, of course, this is the real combat that they've been preparing for this entire time, to expand Israel's influence further north. Potentially that we'll probably see the same in the northeast of Syria very soon, especially since, every second Israeli is essentially calling the regime of al-Jilani, al-Shara in Damascus, essentially a terrorist regime, which they're not wrong, but we know that they supported that particular regime coming into power in the first place exactly for the purpose of creating a pretext to later annex as many territories or create these artificial buffer zones which they can utilize to their own military means in the future. So it's incredibly sad that, whenever you read about the Lebanese war of this particular year and the intense bombings, there's always reports of civilians actually being hit. And naturally, you'd have to understand that Hezbollah, an organization that's existed for well over 40 years at this point, since the Iranian Revolution, you can say, these people they have a long history of fighting, resisting Israeli aggression. They have lore and they have a tradition of resisting what they would, I think, refer to as the Nakba. This is like the second Nakba for them. In some case, this is the return of Israel to land which they've truly wanted to occupy, probably from the very beginning, from the early 1950s onwards. And so the Lebanese people do not have any sort of desire for a ceasefire at the moment. Those in Hezbollah and Amal, they want to push the Israelis out of their lands, and that will only happen through, of course, either Israel conceding, which I don't really see them doing at the moment. I think Israel are willing to escalate the matter as far as possible. Especially, you can sort of see the Israeli motivations, Conrad, in the fact that they've responded to none of the United Nations inquiries. There are officially International Criminal Court warrants still out for Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu, and other service members of the high Israeli command. They completely ignore international law at this point, that those restrictions, and that would perhaps halt an Asiatic or a European power and make them think twice about engaging in any further conflicts. The Israelis really don't see those as boundaries, and so they will continue to procure this war, as many losses as they can carry out. They don't really mind, I think, because, from what we know about Israeli sort of history early on, they do not mind even sending the lowest ranks of their own tribesmen to be slaughtered, to then utilize that grief of the national people to build up a further ire on this patriotic zeal amongst their own. It is a very sort of sacrificial culture in and of itself. And of course, the elites, the top rabbis, you'll see them blessing troops and rapping Nephilim and all these other things. Rapping Tefillim and all these other, conducting these rituals. They do have their own Talmudic chaplains, actually in the military camps and such, but you'll never see them really engage in the conflict. And look, the rabbis themselves have complained that many members of the IDF, a good portion of them, they're just modern Israeli guys and girls, women who really don't really have much stake. They're just, Zoomers, millennials who don't have much training, but they themselves
the Hasidim refuse to even fight in the army.
Well, that's right. So in some capacity, it's these really stupid scapegoat Israelis who are being sent into against Hezbollah as cannon fodder. And in fact, almost you can say in a dark way, they are purifying the nation of Israel. Dare I say, in this Shoah of war. And again, they're being used to dislodge the innocent Palestinians, and the innocent Lebanese people from their own homelands. It's quite severe and very tragic, I think, for everybody involved. But they do sign up for for war. They can conscientiously resist. The IDF servicemen, they can go to prison. They can be detained. They don't have to enlist. And yet, I think they've fallen for the propaganda, just as I think many Americans have fallen for the propaganda of carrying out Operation Epic Fury and such. So the same common tropes, of course, apply to many of these countries conducting this Third World War engaged in it. I think we just have to point towards the Ukrainians to see just how far brainwashing can get you. It can get you to where it's close to maybe 500,000 injured and deceased servicemen. This is how powerful military propaganda is, especially surprisingly in the age of technology when really you can find a second or third opinion on almost any political subject. So let's not be surprised if Israel really pushes the envelope in south of the Litani River with really no other country supporting Hezbollah or the Lebanese people. I note Turkey has not yet come out in support of Lebanon and this Israeli incursion. I think you have to just consider that there are no allies for Hezbollah besides the Houthis, who are very, very far removed, and of course they are. They've already fairly declared war against Israel, and the Iranians who are themselves being, of course, attacked and slaughtered by the United States and Israel. So it really is a tripartite combat situation going on here. And internationally speaking, I think just on the side of diplomacy, Conrad, we have seen some fairly curious diplomatic overtures taking place in the Southern Caucasus, which is a fair bit removed from the Levant, but I think it kind of speaks to the fact that certain fronts, potential future fronts of this war, are trying to be calmed down in order for this, for combat to be isolated. For example, we saw Pezeshkian appear in the Kremlin in Moscow, having a conversation directly with President Putin, and they talked about gas. They spoke about Prime Minister Pashinyan, that is. Pashinyan spoke about the upcoming Armenian election, in which he says, look, well, Armenia is a democratic country, and he kind of alluded to the fact that President Putin doesn't have fair and democratic elections, and he said that, look, in June of 2026, I might be re-elected, I might not be, but it's been a pleasure working with you, Vladimir Vladimirovich. It was very curious how he essentially said that Armenia and Russia will continue to collaborate and they'll continue to work on any sort of defensive agreements. And it's important for Pashinyan to say that because Armenia has perhaps the largest, most armed Russian base south of any Russian territory, larger than Khmeimim, larger than the base in Tartus. So Armenia, the base in Gyumri, is the largest Russian base to Iran as well. So I think Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia's visit to Russia is very key in sort of understanding like Armenia is still willing to sort of bow down to Lord Putin and his aspirations to potentially, if Russia does get involved in any sort of Turkey/Iran situation. The other interesting visit, Conrad, was, of course, Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, visiting President Aliyev in Baku, Azerbaijan, and, of course, stating that there needs to be continued bilateral relations between Azerbaijan and Iran, and that, of course, Pezeshkian said where we are investigating the alleged drone strikes, a few weeks ago that apparently were carried out against Azerbaijan. And of course, I'm no doubt Aliyev off the mic sort of did state to Pezeshkian that he wasn't going to allow Azeri airspace to be used by the Americans or Israelis. But can we really trust Aliyev's statements? I don't think so. And Pezeshkian, I'm sure, could read between the lines there. The other thing they mentioned was that Azerbaijan is willing to provide humanitarian aid to the Iranians. And I think as we spoke about the bridge over Karaj and some of the other infrastructural strikes, which no doubt will happen, especially when Trump reaches his 48-hour deadline in the next few days, that will be a huge matter of concern for the Iranian people. As soon as the America and Israel begin striking these large infrastructural civilian targets all over Iran, just like Israel is doing south of the Litani River, you will have a catastrophic, like a monumentous civilian and humanitarian crisis taking place in Iran, much worse than what the Lebanese people will suffer, but I think that's comparative to population size and such. So I think that's what Pezeshkian really tried to secure with Aliyev, that if things really do go south, that Azerbaijan will at least assist those civilian Iranians, perhaps that will be stranded without electricity, without water, and without food and other health supplies in the northwest portions of Iran if things go really badly. So the positive side of this, Conrad, is that this does spell perhaps the ability of Azerbaijan to stay out of this war, which inevitably will most likely keep Turkey also out of it. So the biggest question I think that we can maybe raise in this entire conflict is what exactly will al-Jawlani al-Shura do and what will the Kurds do? Those particular two cards haven't really been played yet in this particular war. And yeah, we are in the fifth week, so we're still fairly early on into it. There hasn't been a boots on the ground type invasion, but those two particular forces have been utilized, I think, by the Israeli Americans, and we'll see where all of that goes.
No, I completely agree. And I was actually just about to start talking about Syria and Turkey, but we do have more updates on the F-15 situation that continues to unfold. And we finally, I think, found the point of contention now between the IRGC and the Americans on the narrative. And a C-130 Hercules, huge transport aircraft, was destroyed in the operation. The American spin is that it was damaged, then Delta Force then destroyed it so it wouldn't be captured. The IRGC are, of course, claiming that they destroyed it themselves. So C-130 was lost. We have confirmed images of that and everything. So it is real. And so again, whether there were human casualties, I'm sure the IRGC will announce if they are going to say that. And the US has already claimed that there were none. So that's the situation there. As far as Lebanon, great words on that. Dimitri, of course, recently there was a huge IDF unit that was ambushed by Hezbollah in southern Qiyam in the Nabatia direction, which is one of the first towns into Lebanon from that area. That was one of the farthest places they made in, very mountainous, hilly region, of course, very hard to get to a lot of these places. So again, remember, Israel couldn't go all the way into Gaza. Like Israel couldn't go in and take the whole thing. They still have the whole current yellow zone, all this other thing set up. And this area is a lot less flat than Gaza. This is mountainous hills, all these sorts of things. So the Israelis are having a very hard time because like we said, they are fundamentally police occupation enforcers. They are not soldiers. They are not warriors. That's just not who they are. Whereas they are fighting against, some people have argued that Hezbollah's Radwan forces are some of the fiercest fighters in the entire world. So that's the reality there. I know you mentioned Armenia, Dimitri, and recently, of course, Pashinyan has been calling out. He left the CSTO. They've been saying the CSTO. He's like, why would we stay in this when it didn't help us when Azerbaijan invaded? And look, I fault Russia for a lot of the Azerbaijan-Armenia stuff, but Armenia literally never asked for the activation of the CSTO or for troops to come in and help them. So just more Pashinyan lies to continue to cozy up with the West and abandon Russia, which again, I still think Russia made a mistake allowing the Azeris to take Armenia, but that's a situation that is going to continue to be worked out. But you talked about Syria, Dimitri. Of course, Syria, a very chaotic place. One thing that occurred just in the past few days was the storming of the United Arab Emirates embassy in Damascus. Anti-Israel protesters stormed it, removed the UAE flag. Of course, the UAE condemned it, but they ransacked the place, totally overrun. Syria in general, a lot of people have been mobilizing against Israel and moving south there to be stopped by al-Jilani. The Israeli tank fired on Syrian people that were gathered there, killed a civilian in the Quneitra province there, just across from the Israeli-occupied Golan, which of course is also sovereign Syrian territory. So that's the situation as it unfolds there. Of course, the Turkey situation obviously is, I mentioned earlier, but specifically Qatar and Turkey, they are the two countries that are, I think, trying to maintain peace the most. Of course, they are the Sunni powerful states that have their political and geopolitical interests sort of aligned with Iran in the sense that they support Palestine. They generally don't want to see Israel in Syria. And again, like they are anti-Zionist. But unlike Iran, Qatar, until very recently, was the host of CENTCOM, and Turkey hosts massive NATO bases and even American nuclear weapons. So as much as these countries maybe wanted to, or at least wanted to show their people, like they were standing with Palestine against America, none of that was really real, and Iran was always, and Hezbollah were always the only chance that the Palestinians had, which make it even crazier that Hamas, to this very day, have still been disavowing Iran, condemning their attacks on the Gulf states, certain factions within Hamas at least. And these are people that live in Turkey, Qatar, other places. So again, it shows you that there is some reality to the Hamas was funded by Netanyahu at one point because they are, no matter how much genocide they face, they're still Sunni Wahhabi Muslim Brotherhood sectarians who don't like their Shia brothers in Iran and would rather the corrupt and degenerate UAE support them than the Islamic Republic. So that shows you the current state of the Ummah. But regarding Turkey, of course, we talk about Turkey all the time on the show. The rumors are that potentially June might be the end for Erdogan. I'm not making that prediction. Some people are just saying that. But it says here, NATO has strengthened its missile defense posture after a ballistic missile launched from Iran and headed towards Turkey, a member of the alliance, and was intercepted, raising fresh concerns about the widening fallout of the ongoing Iran war. The alliance said its missile defense system successfully shot down the projectile after identifying a threat to a NATO ally. In less than 10 minutes, NATO service members identified a threat to allies. A ballistic missile confirmed its trajectory, alerted land and sea-based missile defense systems, and launched an interceptor to defeat the threat, NATO spokesman Colonel Martin O'Donnell said. The incident prompted NATO to increase its alliance-wide ballistic missile defense posture, with the alliance's 32 member states agreeing during an ambassador-level meeting in Brussels to maintain the heightened alert level until the threat from Iran's attack subsides. Turkey's defense ministry said NATO defense systems intercepted and neutralized a ballistic missile fired from Iran and detected heading towards Turkey, though officials provided a few further details. NATO said the missile was targeting Turkey, but a Turkish official speaking anonymously suggested it may have been aimed at a base in Greek Cyprus, but veered off course. So you see the Turkish officials are always trying to downplay, like, no, the Iranians were just trying to hit one of U.S. storage bases. They have nothing against us, the brotherly Ottomans. It says Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni condemned the incident, calling it an attack on a NATO ally. Meloni expressed her solidarity and support in the face of unjustifiable missile attack during a cell phone call with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This isn't in the article, but Meloni also recently stopped allowing Italian bases to be used for this operation. So she's sort of joined up with the British and the French, who, of course, we'll have to talk about that in a second, but they condemned the war entirely. Despite the seriousness of the incident, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said Washington did not believe the situation would trigger NATO's collective defense clause. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte echoed that assessment. So that's the current status there. But it's important to recognize how, again, Turkey's neutrality and their strict refusal to join in with the war is obviously helpful to Iran. And not only that, but Turkey is probably more responsible than anybody for the reason why the protests in January and the Kurdish factor are not really at play in the current American operation, because there was a Kurdish incursion into Iran from Iraqi Kurdistan and with local Iranian militants participating. And Turkish intelligence immediately shared that with the IRGC, and they were repelled and destroyed. So again, that was obviously a huge morale blow to the Kurds and their aspirations for their state that would extend into Iran. But it also, of course, was at the wrong time. And by the time the United States hardware was in place in the Gulf, all of that fervor to go in had been completely taken out. And the Iranians had, I'm sure, infiltrated, and even the Turks had helped them behind the scenes. And Erbil is one of the main places that's been struck. And at the very beginning of the war, Iran struck it hard because they knew that Kurdish Iraq is going to be where a lot of this is staged. So again, once I think there's a ground operation and there's a major destruction and loss of American lives, there will pretty much be no other thing for the prophecies regarding, at least, to happen next than the fall of Erdogan. And I think 2 months from now, that wouldn't be a surprising timeline for me. So this summer is really going to be one of the most important summers in the history of World War now, to put it lightly. And regarding those ground operations, you mentioned the uranium, Dimitri. This is a headline here. It says, Trump asked military to develop risky plans for ground operation to seize Iran's enriched uranium. Donald Trump ordered the Department of War to prepare for a potential ground operation to seize the 60% enriched uranium. According to two sources speaking with the Washington Post, the Pentagon developed a plan to land troops in Iran, build a runway, and leave the country with Tehran's 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium. The president requested the Department of War draft the battle plans, and he was briefed on them in the past week. In recent weeks, Trump has ordered additional troops to the Middle East that could be used to conduct ground operations in Iran. Axios reported last week the Pentagon developed several options for Trump to choose from that are intended to deliver a final blow. The operations include seizing Iranian islands in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, or attempting to capture Iran's 60% enriched uranium. Seizing the nuclear material will be a difficult operation. The exact location of the uranium is unclear. It is believed that it moved to the Isfahan nuclear facility after the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran in June. It calls for deploying hundreds of thousands of troops to Iran, which could be on the ground for weeks under fire. The uranium is believed to be under caved-in tunnels, meaning U.S. forces would have to clear debris under fire to reach the target. The soldiers would then need to construct a runway to fly the nuclear material out of Iran. Before the U.S. and Israel attacks on Iran that started the war, Tehran offered to dilute its stockpile of enriched uranium to a level where it could be used as nuclear fuel. Trump rejected the Iranian offer and started an aggressive war. So that's obviously, we already knew all of that, but that wouldn't be surprising if that's the operation that goes down. Although, again, this could all be misdirection, and it might be more of a Strait of Hormuz operation. It seems that the economic fallout from that is more important right now than any kind of denuclearization idea. So this might just be, like I said, misdirection. But Dimitri, you of course mentioned the Russian response to the strikes near the Bashir facility, not strong enough at all. The Russians, I think, need to at least 3x their rhetoric, even if they're not going to overtly support Iran militarily. They really need to make this more serious. You mentioned the S-500 air defense system, which, if true, massive, huge respect if that's happening. But again, that's one of those things. I'm sure the Russians wouldn't acknowledge it, but it's like if you're always having to operate in the shadows, you probably need to assert a force posture that will allow you to be open about your operations. Because look, the Americans, they pretty openly move equipment and troops around knowing what they're doing here. Not that we want to broadcast our moves, but you want to be strong enough to where you can strongly support your ally. And of course, China has been slowly but surely condemning Israel and the U.S. more and more. Their foreign ministry explicitly said that this war is a war of aggression from Israel and America and needs to stop immediately. But not only are these Russian nuclear facilities in Iran coming under fire, and obviously Russian air defense is going there, but the Russia-Ukraine war continues on. And apparently this month, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, either April or May, it said, will be traveling to Ukraine for more negotiations. So we'll at least have 3 Jews, Zelensky, Witkoff and Kushner, and maybe Russia will send some of its Jews. That's really who we want negotiating. Everything in the world is just a bunch of Jews. But it seems that the Russians are generally uninterested in negotiations at this phase, much like the Iranians, of course, who have rejected all of it. So, Dmitry, give us some quick updates on the Russia-Ukraine war, the status of negotiations before we talk about a few other fronts and then wrap this up.
No, of course. There's been some pretty interesting updates in relation to diplomacy first, which I'll mention before we move on to the military. But there was actually a combined Russian State Duma delegation that traveled to America, in particular to meet with Anna Polina Luna and some other members of the Trump administration. And they came back, unfortunately, fruitless. There's been no real move towards any sort of ceasefire discussions on Ukraine. Of course, the head of this delegation and one of the members of the delegation, in fact, gave a very off the filter, uncensored interview, actually, with Mikhail Delyagin. He's a member of course, he's a member of the right-wing political party, which now at the moment Zhirinovsky's son leads. So he's a member of, I guess, what you would call the Russian opposition to United Russia. Mikhail Delyagin is a well-known Russian economist. He was a member of this delegation. There was all as well as Boris Chernyshov, who was a member of another political party in Russia, more left-wing, and Dmitry Isakov, another, of course. So there was basically a conglomeration of various party members from Russia who traveled to the US to discuss Ukraine specifically and Russo-American relations. It was quite varied. I think they didn't really have an agenda to discuss in total. But the leader of this delegation was United Russia's Vyacheslav Nikonov, who a lot of people actually said that, wow, this is a big deal because Vyacheslav Nikonov is the grandson of Vyacheslav Molotov personally. So Molotov-Skryabin was, of course, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That's that exact Molotov. This is Stalin's foreign minister, the right-hand man of Stalin in terms of, the pre-World War II relations with Germany and other countries. So pretty interesting heritage, but I just want to mention, obviously, Nikonov himself, obviously having Jewish heritage because Molotov's wife was Jewish. So that's quite curious there as well. But Delyagin did say that he says his perception of what Washington, D.C. was like in relation to this very diverse Russian delegation in his almost hour and a half interview on YouTube, he clearly said that, he's like, well, it appears that although Anna Polina Luna was very much pro-Russian and she spoke out in favor of, stopping the church persecution and the acceptance of Russian language in Ukraine, he says that the thing that struck him the most was that the State Department, he believes, the American U.S. State Department under Donald J. Trump, under Marco Rubio specifically, is extremely anti-Russian. He said Marco Rubio gave off this perception. Marco Rubio refused actually to meet the Duma delegates, and they were given this basically memo from inside of Russia that, if you do speak to Marco Rubio, do so with caution because apparently he's extremely anti-Russian. So, there is this sort of growing sentiment among the Russian elites that J.D. Vance is probably potentially the pro-Russian member of the Trump administration who was, in the most highest position being the vice president. But Marco Rubio specifically apparently is seen as this like very anti-Russian member of Trump's administration, maybe because he was a former neocon and probably still is a neocon to this day. But there was this weird perception of, essentially being anti-Marco Rubio that the delegation came back with. In any case, it didn't achieve anything sort of consequence, similar to previous, delegation discussions by Yuri Ushakov when he spoke to Witkoff, or Sergei Lavrov's discussions with Witkoff and Kushner and all these other figures. They don't seem to reach any sort of real consensus on what should happen in Ukraine. And obviously the war has been escalating. And I say that because there has been like a lightening of the drone warfare that's been happening over the last few weeks. In fact, people even speculated within Russia, as well as we've had the privilege of sort of maybe discussing the ability of Iran to maybe export drones to Russia has been severely crippled, in the few weeks of the Purim War, after this conflict commenced towards the beginning of March 2026. And perhaps that's the reason why Russia stopped drone bombing Ukraine. But now, in fact, drone bombing has well and truly resumed. So there's been at least 200 drones per day over the last week flying into Ukraine, albeit many of these drones are being shot down by Ukraine. So I think in some way the sort of dead period that the Russians have went easy on the Ukrainian infrastructure and on their military targets have given Ukrainians some breathing room, and they've in fact prepared. And the anti-air defense of Ukraine is really showing itself to be quite superb. And not to say the Russians aren't good either, because just over the last day, on Friday, the 4th of April, the Russians themselves have shot down one Flamingo missile, which is again long-range cruise missiles, which the Ukrainians are hitting, not military targets, but specifically like oil refineries and civilian depots, and 308 UAVs were shot down by the Russians. So that's on a daily basis, the Russians are in fact pushing back in terms of air defense, really keeping the Ukrainians, keeping them guessing as to where exactly they should actually fire, which is why most likely it's been, well and truly at this point, a week removed. It's been, the Russians have come to a conclusion that yes, the Ukrainians are trying to carry out these flanking missions with long-range drones, flying them through Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, maybe even around Finland in order to get to some of these Russian long-distance, Baltic ports, to try and damage Russia's budgetary income capacity, exporting this crude oil at these hyperinflated prices during the war in Iran. So Ukrainians most likely are going to try more of these tricks. Maybe we'll see further operations such as Operation Spiderweb, and hopefully the Russians have been preparing for these sort of antics, because there's clearly Zelensky is facing pressure. Like, as Zelensky is traveling around the world giving these sort of diplomatic discussions, he's also counter-signaling Viktor Orban as well. So Viktor Orban is facing an election in Hungary on the 12th of April, so literally Easter Sunday. The elections will be taking place in Hungary in that weekend, and most likely the results of that election will be evident during Bright Week. So next week it'll be quite an intense session in Central Europe to decide whether or not, a power in Europe that has been effectively pro-Russian will be in some way subverted, similar to what happened to Călin Georgescu in December of 2024 during the Romanian election. I mean, Romania potentially had also this ability, just like Slovakia and Hungary, to turn into this sort of bulwark of, right-wing, maybe semi-center-right conservatism, a common sense conservatism within Europe that doesn't just support unconditionally the, Zelensky's fervor in conducting the war further. There are good news, though. There are good news. Obviously, the Druzhba pipeline is still shut down, and most of the blame on that particular gas pipeline is being put on Zelensky. Zelensky's saying that repairs of this pipeline are not possible at the moment, and so he's basically keeping Slovakia and Hungary hostage, which is, I think, a good thing for Russia, because Russia can sort of play this off as if they're the innocents. They just simply wanted to provide gas to their European neighbors and neighborly friendly countries, and Zelensky is the one who's interrupting it. In terms of the front lines, there's been a fair bit of movement on the Lugansk direction. In fact, the entire People's Republic of Lugansk, for the first time, so this is one of the 4 republics that the Russians set out to liberate, has been completely liberated officially. Every single village, and yes, for a long time, the Ukrainians were sort of holding out, and this is next to the city of Kupiansk, so you can kind of see why did the Russians take so long in taking these villages? Well, they served really no strategic purpose. There was no defensive positions there that the Russians could, again, muster as a bridgehead to push further into Ukrainian territories. There were no major cities there. Kupiansk was really, and still is, the target the Russians are really fighting for at the moment. But all the villages in Lugansk have been taken. So in fact, one of the republics officially this week in April has been entirely liberated. So we can, I guess, celebrate that as a sort of partial victory by the Russian Federation in this war. And Lugansk, for the first time since 2014, is entirely under, well, we can say, Russian control. So that's, I think, a huge achievement to, again, kudos to all the Russian generals and local commanders such as Batman and Alexei Mozgovoy, who actually defended Lugansk in those early years. I'm sure they're smiling down at us. And, at the Russian troops who actually conducted these operations to finally free their territory from these Banderites who, again, have invaded on the grounds that they would remove the pro-Russian forces, like all those almost more than a decade ago now. It's very interesting combat, obviously, happening around Konstantinovka, which the Russians are, at the moment, they're controlling over 60% of the city. There's been intense bombings, Russians dropping THAAD 3000s on the Ukrainian side of Konstantinovka. Mind you, you'll notice the way Ukrainian air defense is positioned. Notice the Russians are taking a lot less risks with their bombings. So there was even a criticism thrown out. Some of the Russian geopolitical news analysts, for example, look, I don't watch the show very often, but on Solovyov's Channel 1 in Russia, there was a criticism thrown out at him. Why are the Israelis and the Americans, when they, for example, bomb a bridge, they hit the bridge directly, very accurately, center force, and the bridge is actually damaged. But when the Russians bomb, particular blocks or defensive positions of Ukrainians, the bombs sometimes fall off target. Well, the answer was that the Russians are actually taking a lot more care using their air force. They're actually firing these guided munitions from tens of kilometers away. And actually the guided munitions are flying in. They're not actually flying well and truly overhead, or they're taking these massive risks like the Israelis and the Americans are doing in Iran. So you can almost see that in some ways the air sortie attacks, judging by how the Israelis and Americans are doing it over Iran, are much more desperate in a way because they want results faster and sooner, almost as if Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump are really pushing the accelerator. Whereas in Russia's case, really, they see a defensive position in the distance and they really just take aim, and they know that they'll have the capacity to fire it several times over the span of a month. And really, there's no urgency there, as it's well and truly now a war of attrition. So there is a true difference in how the Air Force is being used here. You don't have that same desperation by the Israelis and the Americans that, you're not seeing that in Eastern Europe at the moment. So it's quite interesting, the difference there. Some other really good news this week as well. The Anatoly Kalotkin has in fact reached Cuba and has delivered all of those oil and energy supplies to the Cuban people. So in fact, Cuba will be well and truly able to sustain itself infrastructure-wise and in terms of using all of that oil energy for the next 2 weeks. Some speculate up to 3 if they begin rationing, which they probably should. And the really interesting thing is the ship, of course, Anatoly Kalotkin, was actually named after a famous Russian maritime lawyer who, again, sat even in The Hague for a long time. He was the premier Russian, Soviet, and sort of new Russian Federation specialist maritime lawyer who actually discussed the ability of ships being taken over for policing measures. And that was literally, the ship was named after him, right? A guy who's well known in the world in terms of protecting shipping lanes and things like that. And so it would have been really disgusting, actually, if the Americans did seize this ship, which was bringing really infrastructure support, civil support, energy for the Cubans, despite all these, again, angsty, and maybe Marco Rubio, in fact, Conrad, maybe it is that anti-Russian, sort of his anti-communist aspirations, being a Cuban refugee, Cuban emigre himself. Maybe that's what's pushing him towards making some of these Russophobic decisions. But in any case, the Russians are seeing success on almost every single front. And sadly, I would say, diplomatically speaking, this week, we've seen no real updates in relation to Iran. In fact, in the previous week, we discussed Sergei Lavrov's interview to correspondents in France, where he clearly said the Russians are not providing intelligence to Iran, which again was a fairly blackpilling, I would say. And this week, in fact, Sergei Lavrov has continued to emphasize the need for Iran and the US to actually sit down at the negotiating table, and Israel as well, which is, again, I'm not sure how constructive that is at this point. Even if a country like Oman is the middleman. Mind you, Oman is extremely... The Omani mediators have a huge history of actually acting as mediators in these Middle Eastern conflicts, because if you recall the Saudi-led intervention into Yemen, which actually took place at the same time as the Syrian civil war, but between 2015 and I think it's, you can say in some capacity it's still ongoing, that 11-year conflict, Oman was actually acting as the mediator to back off the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis from holding particular positions in Yemen in that war against the Houthis. So Oman really, at this point, is really potentially the only country in the Middle East who can, in some capacity, sustain any sort of ceasefire conversation. Sergei Lavrov himself, although he's called for it, although he's offered to act in this sort of capacity, there is no leverage that Russia really holds over these discussions. And the best example of that, Conrad, is the fact that there's been no official response to the port bombing on the Caspian Sea from the Russian Federation. There's been no official, major response to the Bushehr nuclear power plant being put at risk by the Israelis and the Americans. If anything, the Russian position at the moment is sit back and monitor the situation, which, as we said last week, is probably not the most appropriate measure, especially if you consider that this current World War III is a two-front conflict, but with Russia and Iran essentially fighting off allied enemies in the face of, unfortunately, America, Israel, and Ukraine at the same time. So as the war rages on, Russia at the moment is holding, I think, the superior position on the front lines, and they're sort of inching closer. I think after Konstantinovka falls, and when we receive that news, it could happen literally in the next few weeks, possibly, hopefully, as far as the Russians are concerned, closer to the 9th of May, so that the Russians can again celebrate another Victory Day and speak about, the anti-Nazi victory in the Second World War, and sort of make an analogy to the fall of Konstantinovka and how that's almost similar to taking Berlin and all of this other very interesting historical facts. The point is that once the Russians take Konstantinovka, the inevitability of Drushkovka, Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk, the last 3 strongholds of the Ukrainians in the Donetsk People's Republic, Donetsk Oblast, they'll be put at an immense risk, and perhaps that's where we may see some potential ceasefires. Domestically speaking, in Russia, there's some very, very intense internet censorship ongoing at the moment. Internet shutdowns are quite a major factor at the moment. For some reason, the two of Russia's capital cities are experiencing some crazy internet lockdowns throughout this entire week. So there's entire businesses which have lost a ton of revenue because simply they can't be connecting to their own servers. There's indiscriminate sort of internet bans by waves by the Russian government. There's no explanations for it either. But also, I think despite all of these sort of civilian shortcomings, there have been no protests in Moscow or St. Petersburg in relation to a lot of these internet shutdowns, which really showed that the Russian population, generally speaking, is still sort of united around President Putin and the need for the liberation of the territories, despite all of these, lifestyle, shall we say, lifestyle hurdles that are being thrown their way because the government, the excuse that's being thrown out is the internet shutdowns are an attempt to thwart Ukrainian hackers or in an attempt to stop Ukrainian drones from utilizing some of those connections. So very interesting, but at the moment, Russia is the sort of Eastern European western part of Russia. The European peninsula side of it is, I think, well and truly at the moment experiencing fairly intense conflict. Like we've seen Ukrainian drones hit infrastructural buildings, hit civilian apartments. There's been casualties on all sides. So the war has been here for a long time. And for the Russian population, generally speaking, I think many of them have come to realize that really the war is not going away unless the regime in Kiev has to change and severely morph and transform itself. And clearly Zelensky, Budanov, this particular government in the Rada as well, all of these parliamentary members of Ukrainians, they're not actually for a ceasefire, they're not for peace. Zelensky is perhaps the largest warmonger who's been in Eastern Europe for a long time now. So I think the Russian population is kind of turning more and more anti-Ukrainian the longer the conflict continues, which I think is well and truly is a sad thing because it's a united people which has been separated by seemingly artificial political measures over the last few decades. But I mean, that's a history lesson for another day.
Now, it seems to me that the Russians have a timeline in their head with which they will be escalating along the line of Ukraine not pulling out of Donetsk specifically. It always disappoints me that they don't mention the rest of Zaporozhye and Kherson when they make their demands for Ukraine to pull out of the Donbass, as they say. But it's clear that they're probably going to increase the strikes on infrastructure and probably deploy more troops from the quote-unquote second army that we mentioned in previous episodes pretty soon here, because it's clear the Iran war is going to keep going on. It's clear that America's going to keep stretching itself too thin. It's clear that Russia's not that interested in negotiations. So if you don't escalate, then I really have questions because what are you doing? So that's where we're at. But good analysis of the Ukraine front, Dimitri. Of course, before I move on to the miscellaneous news, one thing about the Middle East, you mentioned Yemen. We did see Saudi-backed forces who, again, want to have a united Yemen under Saudi influence. They fired on civilians and people that were going to attend a Southern Transition Council it's a UAE-backed group that supports the creation of South Arabia as an independent state. They control much of the south of Yemen. The Saudi-backed forces fired on them and killed several people that were trying to make it to a separatist protest to show their support for the STC, the Southern Transition Council. So Yemen, there's violence going on there that doesn't even have to do with Ansar Allah. And again, Ansar Allah has yet to really lock in their closure of the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, which if I had to wager one thing was going to come from the targeting of Iranian petrochemicals, it's going to be the involvement of the Houthis. And now that the UAE and Saudi Arabia seem to have had drones shot down over Iran, proving their participation in the conflict, I think in the next 2 weeks we're going to see Ansar Allah, the Yemenis, shut down the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and start really hitting the Red Sea. So stay tuned for that. But moving away from Russia, the Middle East, the usual places we talk to, one of the most fascinating stories this week, this is from March 30th. It says here, the leader of Taiwan's largest opposition party has accepted Chinese President Xi Jinping's invitation to visit China in April, a month before U.S. President Donald Trump is set to meet with Xi in Beijing. Song Tao, a director of the Taiwan Affairs Office of the State Council, China's executive branch, stated that assuming the Kuomintang, which is the Chinese Nationalist Party, the opposition party, KMT, in November, Cheng Li won. She repeatedly expressed her desire to visit the mainland, the state news outlet Xinhua reported. To promote the peaceful development of relations between the KMT and the CPC and cross-strait relations, I'm authorized to announce that the CPC Central Committee and General Secretary led a KMT delegation, invite Chairperson Cheng Li Wen to lead a KMT delegation to visit Jiangsu, Shanghai. Sorry, this article is clearly written by a Chinese person. Jiangsu, Shanghai, and Beijing from April 7th to 12th. During a talk with Taiwan Foreign Correspondents Club last Monday, Chang reaffirmed her intention to meet with Xi to convey that the path to peace between Beijing and Taipei is politically viable. And so again, not only is this an opposition, but this is the Kuomintang, the sort of founding party of Taiwan, the party of Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese Nationalist Party, the most popular party. Again, the only reason that the Democratic Progressive Party of Taiwan is even in power is because of U.S. intervention. The KMT has more seats in the Taiwanese parliament than the Democratic Progressive Party. I believe they have 4 or 5 more seats. They're just not in government. And the very small center-left third party even is in the opposition with the KMT. So they are the most powerful party. They are the center-right nationalist party, which is where most Taiwanese people's positions lie. So whenever there are new elections, it's undoubted. To me, it's pretty likely that this woman will come to power, and she's meeting with Xi Jinping. They're talking about what will clearly be something akin to the Hong Kong model in Taiwan, where they will basically keep their system. They will keep some kind of local governance. They won't immediately have the same levels of censorship, sort of civic police oversight that is in the mainland. It'll be something more akin to Hong Kong, Macau, these other special systems where it's, one nation, two systems, and undoubtedly it will then be used to slowly integrate the Taiwanese population into being normal, happy citizens, and they will undoubtedly have more party members recruited from there. The party will have a presence and be involved, and slowly but surely they will become the main presence there. And I think that's what Xi wants by 2027. If he can do that instead of having any kind of violence, that would be desirable, and that would be a huge blow to the U.S. strategic island chain strategy in the region. And at that point, you might even see Japan start to pivot, because of course we got the Japanese nationalists in power and hope that they would help us against China due to historical grievances. And sure, it's going to be a tough thing to see them ally with China in any way, but if they truly see it as part of their strategic interest to at least be neutral and on good terms with China, and they see the U.S. as someone bringing in liberalism, mass migration, anti-national activities and ideas, which they do, then we might see Japan switch up on Trump in the West, just like they very quickly started paying Iranian tolls and cutting a deal with Iran to pass through the Straits of Hormuz. So many things to watch in East Asia. Of course, South Korea, their missile defenses are now depleted, having been shipped out to the Persian Gulf. Kim Jong-un has done recent missile tests. So all sorts of tensions across all of our major allies that we've been using to surround China here. But another big piece of news, sort of similar, regarding secession in breakaway regions. The secessionists in Alberta, the most conservative region of Canada, claim to now have gathered well over 178,000 signatures, of which only 177,000 are required to then have a referendum on the ballot for voters to choose if they want to leave Canada. So Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has said she will move forward with a province-wide referendum if the required number of signatures are gathered. Later this month in April, they will be verified. So the claim by the organizers is they're going to be trying to get well over 200,000 signatures so that no matter how many the elections committee in Alberta tries to throw out, they will have enough to see this through. And again, I'm not saying 100% that it will pass if it's put on the ballot, but it seems very likely that it will be on the ballot. And I'd wager it's going to get at least 40% of the vote if it's put to the people. So Canada collapse incoming, celebrate everybody. It's finally over. This Reddit tier menace to our north, us Americans, it'll go away. Alberta very well may join the United States after a few years of independence. And if Alberta gets independence, the Quebecois are going to break away very, very soon, maintain their identity. And then the rest of Canada will have a choice to make. I'd wager they'll probably stick together, but maybe BC will start talking with Alaska, Washington, Oregon, maybe Newfoundland, the places out on the West Coast will start talking with Quebec about doing something with them. So Canada is over, and it can't really come any sooner as far as I'm concerned. Unfortunately, it's too late because the place has been entirely replaced with Jeets. Hopefully the Albertans can get rid of the slightly smaller amount of Jeets that they have and, then reestablish a real demographic security there. But Canada as a whole, unfortunately, demographically cooked themselves in the past 15 years at a potentially unfixable level. So that's the reality there. But only other electoral thing I wanted to discuss briefly was the upcoming Hungarian election. I'm not sure if we'll have another show before this happens, but it appears that Viktor Orban may be going down. Obviously, everybody is going to be pumping all of their resources into taking him out, to Peter Magyar, who is just, again, in Hungary, it's just everybody, globalists, leftists, communists, gay homos, brown lovers, all this kind of stuff, just against Orban. And again, unfortunately, Orban's downfall here is that he is associated with the two least popular political figures in the world right now, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, who are his two closest political allies. So as much as I could say Hungarians should not oust Orban. I can assure you it will not make your country better. You will not get cheaper oil. Orban's deals with Russia are the best you're going to get from that. You will not have a better economy, and you certainly will not somehow have a better society, because there's no way that they will maintain the exact same rigorous anti-migrant policies, even though I'm sure they can't campaign on being pro-migrant. So we'll see how this goes. Again, I can't blame people not voting for Orban because he's tied to Trump, and if you're a European, you have to be anti-Trump. The AfD, smartly, is openly saying, yes, American bases need to leave Europe, and Trump's talk about leaving NATO, the AfD is getting behind it, which again, Trump leaving NATO, that would help Europe a whole lot more than it would help America, which again, it's all kayfabe. America's not going to leave NATO. They're just trying to get Europe and other countries, even like Turkey, to get involved in the conflict in Iran. So obviously that's not really true. But this Hungary election, unfortunately, Orban, if he falls, you can put the blame squarely on Donald Trump and, of course, Netanyahu as well. And if Orban were smart, he'd get on TV right now and literally disavow both of those people. He should be genuine about it, of course, but even if it's cynical, he should literally get on TV, disavow Trump, disavow Netanyahu, and disavow the war. But obviously he's not going to do that because he is, unfortunately, and I say this regrettably, he's effectively a Likud operative who was put into Hungary to serve their interests in many ways. So the fact that he's pro-Russia just allows Russia to help and be another power that wants him in power as well. So, and again, the Likud influence there, we've discussed it on the show too, very regrettable, but that does not mean I want to see him lose. I think he should still win, and he should learn from the fact that he needs to extricate himself from American influence entirely just because Trump and his right-wing Jewish buddies are supportive of him being nationalist or whatever. That doesn't mean they're friends of Hungary. So that is that situation. Only other story I had before church news is about the Artemis, which of course you all already know that I don't believe is real. The Artemis launch, is the mission to circle orbit the moon, I guess, because we of course lost the technology to go to the moon that we supposedly did with the compute power of a calculator in the late 60s. But now we have to go around the moon, and get this. NASA came out yesterday at their press conference and said they won't be doing any live broadcasts because the astronauts will be asleep when the Goldstone giant radar facility that we supposedly use to talk to astronauts in space, they're going to be asleep when that's going to be facing the craft due to the rotation of the Earth. So they're just going to use that time to download and upload videos from the craft instead. So again, we have laser-guided precision missiles that can strike deep inside Iran from submarines, but we can't have a live video from space, which we supposedly had live audio in the 1960s. So if you believe this stuff, I'm sorry, you're just kind of stupid. I get it that it sounds crazy, but watch the Space is Fake episode with Anthony Westgate and I. We may have that linked below, but of course we'll also have the Q&A thread linked below, which, reminder, ask your questions in the Q&A thread that's linked down below for whatever you want Dimitri and I to answer. But I don't think the Artemis is real. I don't believe in space. And I think a lot of these things, if you really pay close attention and you don't just look at it like Jewish eye candy, like everybody else is soy pogging about it, you'll realize it's pretty obvious nonsense. And of course, they've got a black guy and a woman up there and everyone's talking about how amazing it is. So don't fall for the psyop. Don't think to be a pro-white Western Civ guy that you have to believe all this space nonsense. We did not go to the moon. The Soviets obviously were also in on all the lies. The whole space race was about propelling nihilistic atheism to the forefront based on quote-unquote scientific consensus. So don't fall for it. St. Gabriel Ergabadzi said we shouldn't be focusing on the sky nonsense and all this alien stuff, but we're hearing more and more about the disclosure. Bob Lazar, a liar, is back on Joe Rogan. We're hearing from Matt Gaetz and others that there are now confirmed human-alien breeding programs and that aliens are 100% real. Obama's talked about it. So who knows? Things go crazy with the war. The Jews feel like they're slipping and losing hegemony. Suddenly we go with Project Bluebeam in the midst of World War III. So it really is a Seraphim Rose moment. It's a St. Paisios moment, a St. Seraphim Rose moment, a St. Gabriel Ergabadzi moment. It's everything. The arc of history bends towards the saints. I say it a million times, but even me on the literal saints prophecy, geopolitical, theopolitical analysis show, it still continues to shock me just how prescient and correct the saints were, both in their spiritual prescriptions and denunciations of our age and in their prophetic clairvoyance about what we are literally experiencing. So truly humbling to witness, and we all need to stay in repentance. I know I'm not repenting enough considering how obvious the signs are, and I continue to sin. So everyone really repent and use these incredible prophetic times that we live in as, be grateful to God that we are able to live in such incredible times as these, and so clearly see a message of repentance that we can embrace. I mean, think how lucky we are to have these signs, to know to repent, and to know we can make it into the kingdom with nowhere near as much effort as the saints of old did. Because Elder Ephraim, they've said, just with the Jesus prayer, the believers of these latter days will be saved. So take heart in that. But any thoughts on these random assortment of autistic stories I just laid out, Dimitri? If not, feel free to lead us into the church news segment as we wrap things up.
No, I completely agree with your assessment of what's taking place between Taiwan and China. I think that'll be crucial. We'll keep following those stories as they develop, because clearly the Great War of the Pacific, the Oriental axis of the World War, will be, I think, a theater which potentially America would like to get involved with in the near future, especially prior to the massive economic collapse that will happen. They will make sure that they will use those 10 aircraft carriers to the fullest of their potential, and that's primarily maybe, well, I think as the elites and the deep state hope, will be against the People's Republic of China and sort of their hegemony, especially since the People's Republic of China has supported Russia and some of these other anti-American, anti-Israeli regimes such as Iran over the last few years, and continues to do that. I mean, that's definitely a threat that they would like to take out or at least provoke in the near future. So that's a very important theater to follow. And the religion of the future angle is entirely correct, especially in this age of distractions. But there was a particular, I would just begin with probably the strangest story of the week, which is Metropolitan Onufry of Kiev publicly blessed 9 vehicles. So these are massive vans, SUVs, four-wheel drive vehicles, which were actually donated by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Canonical Church, to the Ukrainian 5th Separate Assault Brigade. So this is actually the Ukrainian army. This particular assault brigade is a brigade of Ukrainian veterans. It's one of the most powerful infantry brigades in all of Ukraine, because in particular they fought in the battles of Bakhmut, Toretsk, specifically, and now they're fighting in the area around the Ukrainian-held Chasiv Yar, so deep within the Ukrainian-held Donbass. And 9 of these vehicles were blessed by Metropolitan Onufry personally. There are photographs of him standing there with the holy water blessing these vehicles, and he's saying that they will be used for the evacuation of the wounded and the execution of combat tasks on the front lines. For all of those, I guess, pro-Western folks who are saying the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is somehow collaborating with the Russians and sabotaging, subverting the Ukrainian will to defend themselves, that's clearly not the case. We have Metropolitan Onufry literally blessing military vehicles. So, and look, I'm maybe somewhat critical about that particular move, but in any case, we know how these vehicles function. Although they appear to be civilian vehicles and they have regular civilian number plates, what they do is they load them up with drones, ammunition, weapons, maybe even artillery shells potentially if required on the front lines with some of these smaller cannons. And they actually take them to the front lines. And then, of course, they pile on injured, sometimes even the bodies of deceased Ukrainians from the front lines, and then they deliver those further westwards. So they have this dualistic role. And yes, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church with Metropolitan Onufry just blessed them. So that's a sort of interesting story that maybe we can refer to in the future. This is what's happening in April 2026. I guess a good news story that's been actually official. It's been stated this week, and most likely because of all the pressure by Orthodox Christians primarily, but also Roman Catholics, maybe even certain Protestants, Armenian Apostolic Church have probably applied pressure on the Israeli government to at least allow a limited ceremony to take place to receive the Holy Fire on Holy and Great Saturday this Easter. So in fact, there will be a reception of the Holy Fire in the Holy Sepulchre inside of course, Jerusalem and the Old City. So that's quite good, because we were worried that the Israeli government would use the pretext of the war of Iran and the Hezbollah, the Houthi bombing, to essentially shut down any sort of Orthodox rituals and services taking place, especially during such a holy period, and obviously these people love to desecrate Orthodox Christian sites, whether it's in Eastern Europe or in Palestine, in Gaza, elsewhere. And, this was a good excuse for them to maybe meddle in the affairs of Christians, and yet the pressure was a bit too strong on them. And at the moment, Israel is trying not to openly portray itself as an anti-Christian power, I think for clear means, in order to have more Americans killed in the current, Operation Epic Fury. So that's I guess a good news story. So we definitely most likely will see the Holy Fire come down if God wills it. And there was also the interesting appearance, Conrad, of an archbishop, which, you met and spoke to and interviewed. And of course, that's Archbishop Marcel has appeared at the Human Rights Council of the UN. He gave a video address where he spoke about the pressure of the Moldovan government on the Moldovan Orthodox Church, and how In fact, even after the election, the sort of pressure and the bullying of Moldovan Orthodox Christians continues to be enacted by, and he spoke about this in relation to human rights. And the other figure that appeared at the 61st session of the Human Rights Council of the UN was, literally a confessor for Christ, Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy, who was physically beaten several times. There's footage of his cathedrals being taken over from central Ukraine. He's a very well-known figure among those of us who venerate and respect all of the confessors and martyrs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So both of these figures, in a way, appearing together at the United Nations Human Rights 61st Session Council was just absolutely amazing. And they managed to speak respectively about their own local issues and what they're facing from either the Moldovan anti-Christian government or be it the Zelensky terrorist government, which has really continued to sort of escalate the persecution of the church there. So that's quite amazing. There was quite a bizarre story, actually. This one's somewhat amusing, Conrad, but it was released by the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. On the 31st of March, they released a 3-paragraph statement criticizing Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, stating that he was aiming to divide and conquer, and after the death of Patriarch Ilya of Georgia, that he was trying to meddle in the affairs of the re-election of the next Georgian Patriarch, potentially, considering Metropolitan Abraham Garmeli of Georgia, because, well, he has these like pro-European, pro-NATO views, or maybe Metropolitan Gregory. So the foreign intelligence of the Russian Federation, for whatever reason, is very openly criticizing, for the second time already in the last 12 months, Patriarch Bartholomew. And interestingly enough, right at the end of their statement in the 3rd paragraph, they say very clearly that Patriarch Bartholomew has like the wrong view of church ecclesiology, and he kind of mistakes primacy of honor with primacy of power. And he should pay attention to the 2nd canon of the Second Ecumenical Council, which states regional bishops shall not extend their authority to churches outside of their own region. So for the first time perhaps in recent history in the history of Russia, we have the Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia, literally Russian spies, quoting ecumenical council canons openly in their press briefings. So that's quite, I think, bizarre. But it's also an interesting thing that Russia as a state, for whatever reason, it does see the interests of local Orthodox churches as maybe somehow related to their own national security, definitely towards the security of local Orthodox churches in general, because unfortunately, I think the key message here is that the EP, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Istanbul, has been somewhat compromised by either American or other intelligence agencies, or at least somewhat has been the synod there has been subverted by them. Of course, they still have grace and all of these things, but at least the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service is pointing out that Patriarch Bartholomew perhaps does not have that same angelic visage as maybe somebody as the late Patriarch Ilya of Georgia, or some of these other hierarchs of local churches. Like Patriarch Bartholomew is clearly here being criticized openly by President Putin's government. I mean, this is a interesting confrontation of church and state taking place, but I think it's maybe one of many criticisms that will be befall Patriarch Bartholomew, because to this point, he has involved himself not just in the promotion of schism in Ukraine, but also in the Baltics and other places. So I think their statement is not without truth to it. I mean, in some ways, the Foreign Intelligence Service, maybe I don't know if they're listening to this podcast in particular, but they are receiving news from somewhere. So quite interesting. And perhaps they may be even receiving their own intel from deep within the ecumenical patriarchate themselves. I'm not saying they're spying on the patriarch, but who knows at this point. The last story I have mentioning this week is actually a great, really good news piece, because maybe it points towards the Russian Federation perhaps becoming a bit more based. Well, in November last year, there was a great Orthodox philanthropist, probably the second richest Orthodox Christian man who's contributed to monarchism in Russia after, of course, Conrad, your friend Konstantin Malafeyev, right? The Russian billionaire who has also created Tsargrad and some of these other great Russian schools and has contributed to Orthodox Christian monarchism in Russia itself as a philanthropist. This figure, Basil Boyko Veliki, has been running several dairy farms inside of European Russia. He's been an entrepreneur for many years since the collapse of the USSR and has been doing so quite fairly. But in his spare time, where does he invest his hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars? He actually puts them into investigating the murder of the Romanovs. Specifically, he himself personally, and I have a copy of this book, he published the book in 2023 in relation to the Romanov ritual murder. And he actually said that the relics that are being held in the Petropavlovsk Cathedral in St. Petersburg, most likely not the relics of the Romanovs. So this is a book that this Russian millionaire published. He also has personally, for his own money, he's funded all these various big meetings within Russia, whether it's in Yekaterinburg, St. Petersburg, or Moscow, where all these Russian bishops, historians, theologians, or just cultural, political figures gather to discuss the issue of the killing of the Romanovs, the murder of the family, as well as potentially the ritual aspects of it. So he's probably the only philanthropist in all of Russia who's been discussing this. But why I mention him today is because, well, in November last year, he was sentenced to 15 years of prison for white-collar crime, embezzlement, all these other, apparently tax evasion, all these other things. And he pleaded innocent the entire process, right, for the entire process. And this particular sentence has recently just been laid low. So he said that, look, there's been apparently a statutory expiry, so he will be released in May or June of this year. So that's quite really good news, because Basil Boyko-Veliki is probably one of the best. I mean, he's worked with people like Yuri Vorobyevsky, Mikhail Nazarov, many of these great authors who we quote in our book Ritual Regicide. He even funded people like Peter Multatuli. In fact, if you ask me, I can post in the comments section of this particular podcast, there is actually a 7.5-hour video on YouTube with not that many views, where it's a massive conference discussing the relics of the Romanovs, some of the criticisms people have in relation to the relics, and there's experts, historians coming on to speak at this conference, which Basil Boyko-Veliki personally organized through his own philanthropic means. So this is a man who, I think in some ways, he's one of these like World War Now type figures who we haven't had on the show yet. Potentially in the future we may have him, but especially now that he'll be released from prison soon. But the fact that the Russian courts, for whatever reason, overturned this decision is like a huge win, I think, for the right-wing movement within Russia. I mean, it just shows that maybe there are sort of people within power somewhere in St. Petersburg or in Moscow who can make these key decisions to allow the illumination and the enlightenment in an orthodox positive sense of the Russian population continue, and not to censor these, so-called Boyko-Veliki evil anti-Semites who claim, I mean, he personally claimed that, he says that, look, the ritual regicide of the Romanovs was Talmudic in nature. And he says everything we've stated in our 2 releases of Ritual Regicide, he completely confirms that. So thank God he'll be released. I think there were a lot of elders most likely within Russia praying for his freedom. So it's good to see that prayers really do have an effect in this world.
That's why you got to stay in touch with your local monks and regional monasteries, so that if you get, falsely persecuted by the state for being too base, they can pray for you. That's better than even the best legal defense. But really great analysis. Glad to hear that Boykov is free. But unfortunately, at least for me, the biggest news story I saw this week for the church is the unfortunate bombing of the St. Nicholas Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Iran. This is from Ortho Christian. It says the St. Nicholas Russian Orthodox Church Cathedral in the Iranian capital of Tehran sustained damage from 2 missile strikes on the morning of April 1st, according to a statement from the Russian embassy in Iran. Windows and doors were blown out in the main building and auxiliary outbuildings. The Department of External Church Relations also notes that the central gates, 1 church window, and a glass icon case were broken. The embassy attributed the damage to American-Israeli military action. The Russian home for the elderly, located on the grounds adjacent to the cathedral, also suffered significant damage, including a partially collapsed roof. Elderly residents continue to live at the facility as dependents. The embassy reported no casualties or injuries. The parish community now has no access to its church on the eve of Holy Week and Pascha. The cathedral is listed on Iran's National Register of Cultural Heritage. So pray for the Orthodox Christians of Tehran. Their church has been severely damaged. So it's very unfortunate. They're in a similar situation to the Christians in Jerusalem, who, of course, will be having somewhat limited restrictions to their Holy Fire, Holy Saturday, Pascha celebrations, but hopefully nothing changes between now and then that would disrupt these plans, because the Jews will look for any excuse to stop this from happening. They pretty much find any excuse every year to stop the Transfiguration celebrations on Mount Tabor, where the cloud appears miraculously every year. So the Jews will be looking for any reason to stop this. But one final story, we have the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, which is my favorite museum in Moscow. I've been several times. They have given for 49 years the Vladimir and Donskoy icons of the Theotokos to the Russian Orthodox Church. I've been able to venerate the Vladimir Theotokos, and it's an incredible icon, really beautiful. So it's great to see. Now they're being housed in the Christ the Savior Cathedral, not in the Tretyakov Gallery, which, to be fair, in the Tretyakov Gallery, they were already in a church that exists on site and is used for services fairly often. So it's not like it was in a museum hidden away somewhere or anything. Everyone could venerate it. It was set up for veneration and it was in a church, but you couldn't exactly use it liturgically and it wasn't traveling around. So for the next 50 years, effectively, it seems that's what will be happening. I think it would be good ultimately to see the gallery give the icons back to the church, and then the church every few months or so allows the icons to be portrayed in the museum for people to see and all those sorts of things. But it's a good sign, and hopefully in the future all these things will be given back to the church officially. But a final update, of course, on the situation with the F-15 pilot. The recent news is, of course, not just one C-130, but two C-130s were, if you listen to the United States, destroyed by the U.S. on the way out, or if you listen to Iran, they were destroyed by the IRGC as the Americans fled away with their rescued pilot. So chalk that up to the latest American losses on top of the 4 jets, the AWACS, the helicopters, the drones, the Thunderbird. We also have 2 C-130s, which are massive planes, of course. They're called Hercules for a reason. But that's the update. It was a crazy breaking news episode of World War Now here, of course. I really want to encourage everybody to click the Q&A thread down below. If you're behind the paywall already, ask us whatever you want. And if you are not, please consider supporting the show. If you like this weekly analysis, these news roundups, please consider supporting, because not only do you support the show and keep the analysis going, but you get access to the whole other side of World War Now that you're not even seeing, Ether Hour, where we interview incredible guests. And if you want to look at what the interview episodes are like, just watch our free Ether Hour special edition with former Lebanese Prime Minister Yaqub Sarraf, which obviously will also be linked down below, available on Substack, YouTube, and X. Please share, like it on all platforms, regardless of where you watch it. Go check it out on the other platforms, share and like it. We really want this one to get out there, because it isn't just informative about the war going on, but he gets into some really important spiritual stuff. And seeing a politician who is that adept and that intelligent in the realm of faith and that connected with Mount Athos and the saints is really rare and incredible to see. So we want as many people as possible to see that interview. Q&A episode coming up, some other really big guests coming up. So please get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co. It's all linked down below. There's no excuse not to make it there. Download the Substack app if you want. It makes it even easier. But of course, you can also find us on X at worldwarnow_. We're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. Go to the YouTube channel, subscribe there. That's one of the most important things to do as well. We do live streams every week. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at WWN Host. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. We are posting all day, every day. That's where you can see the latest breaking news and a lot of the sources of where we get our breaking news. So with all of that, Dimitri, any final words for the audience here as we sign things off going into the second month? We're already 5 days into the second month of the Purim War, World War III.
No, thank you, all of the great listeners and supporters, especially those who made it to the end of the episode listening to us right now. Keep myself and Conrad, of course, in your prayers, as we're, of course, in the second month of this war, analyzing all the crazy news that's just breaking, but also because it's the great and holy week. We are recording, of course, on the eve of Palm Sunday. So it's a very special time, and hopefully you'll receive the next episode, whether it's just after Easter or beforehand. But keep us in your prayers, especially during this very tough time right at the end of Orthodox Christian Lent, because it is very tough, not just on the body, but also on the spirit, as we're being all tested. So we wish you all the best, and God bless.